The evening air hung thick and heavy in the parking lot of the Birmingham police station, saturated with humidity that clung to the skin like an unwanted embrace. A man's voice sliced through the stillness, sharp and commanding, dripping with an authority he hadn't earned through merit, but had simply taken for himself. "Hands behind your back, don't make me repeat myself," he barked, his tone a jagged edge that grated against the quiet. The sound of his boots scuffing the cracked pavement echoed as he strode forward with deliberate, heavy steps, each one a declaration of his intent to dominate. She stood beside her car, a sleek black sedan that gleamed faintly under the flickering streetlights, her posture unwavering despite the tension crackling around her. Dressed in a tailored blazer and crisp white shirt, she exuded a quiet elegance, her composure a shield against the storm brewing in his eyes. Yet to him, she was nothing more than a tarjeta figure to be sneered at, reduced to a caricature by a man who didn't even bother to ask her name. Suspicion curled his lip as he sized her up, his gaze lingering with disdain. She turned to face him, one eyebrow arching slightly, her calm demeanor a subtle defiance that seemed to unsettle him more than any outburst could. "Is there a problem, officer?" Her voice was smooth, steady as a still lake, betraying none of the irritation simmering beneath her surface. His response came quick, a smirk twisting his features into something cruel. "A problem, oh. There's definitely a problem. Let's start with why someone like you thinks you can park here." He jabbed a finger toward the restricted lot, his words laced with venom as he spat them out. "You lost. Or maybe you think you're clever, sneaking around where you don't belong." The accusation hung in the air, sharp and baseless, a projection of his own insecurities rather than any truth about her. She parted her lips to reply, but he cut her off with a dismissive shake of his head, his voice rising. "Don't even try it. I've seen your kind before thinking you're smarter than everyone else. Guess what? Not today. License and registration. Now." Her eyes narrowed, a flicker of steel flashing in their depths, but she didn't argue. Instead, she moved with deliberate slowness, reaching into her leather bag to retrieve the documents he demanded. Her fingers brushed against the cool plastic of her ID, and for a moment, she felt the weight of what this encounter represented, not just an inconvenience, but a battle against the assumptions he'd already made about her. She handed them over, her gaze never wavering, and he snatched them from her grasp without so much as a glance, his impatience palpable. "Yeah, I'm gonna need you to step out of the vehicle," he snapped, his hand already resting on his belt, fingers twitching to eagerly near the tools of his trade. "What's this about?" she asked, her voice still level, though anyone paying close attention might have caught the faint tremor of anger. Beneath it, a fire carefully banked, but ready to blaze. His lips curled into a sneer. "Wrong place, wrong time, lady. You think you can just park wherever you want. Nice car, nice clothes, too nice for someone like you. Makes me wonder what you're really up to." His words were a taunt, a flimsy excuse masquerading as suspicion, but she saw through it instantly. This wasn't about the car or the parking lot. It was about him, his need to assert control, to bend her to his will simply because he could. Before she could respond, he lunged forward, grabbing her wrist with a roughness that sent a jolt of pain up her arm. He spun her round, his voice thick with contempt. "I said hands behind your back. I've got a feeling about you. Let's see how fast that attitude changes when you're sitting in a cell for trespassing." Or worse, the cold bite of metal handcuffs snapped around her wrists, the sound ringing in her ears like a gunshot. Humiliation washed over her, sharp and bitter, as she felt the eyes of onlookers begin to gather, strangers in the parking lot turning to stare, their whispers rising like static on an old radio. She could sense their pity, their judgment, and it clawed at her insides, threatening to unravel the calm she'd fought so hard to maintain. Her breath hitched, caught in her throat, but she forced it steady. Not here, not now. She had a plan, one he couldn't possibly anticipate, and that knowledge was her anchor. He marched her toward his squad car, shoving her forward with unnecessary force, making her lean against the hood as he patted her down. "What's the matter? Not so confident now, huh?" His taunting voice cut through her like a blade, each word designed to strip away her dignity. "Maybe this'll teach you some respect." She clenched her jaw, her mind racing as she muttered under her breath, barely audible. Respect, the word dripped with irony. A quiet rebellion he almost missed. What was that? He snapped, leaning in closer, his breath hot against her ear. She lifted her head just enough to meet his gaze, her eyes locking with his for the first time. There was no fear there, only a controlled, burning fury that seemed to catch him off guard. "You don't know who you're messing with," she said, her voice low and deliberate, each syllable carrying a weight that made his smirk falter. He laughed, though it sounded forced, a hollow attempt to reclaim his bravado. "Oh, I think I know exactly who you are. They're nobody who thinks the rules don't apply. Don't worry, I'll make sure you learn." The humiliation continued as he paraded her in front of the growing crowd, tossing her ID onto the hood of his car with a careless flick of his wrist, not even bothering to look at it. "Looks like you've had a good run, but it ends here, trust me. You won't be the first to cry about it." But she didn't cry, she didn't beg. Instead, she straightened her spine, her silence a thunderous rebuke that drowned out his bluster. The crowd murmured, some pulling out phones to record the unfolding scene, their lenses capturing every second of his performance. He didn't care, he reveled in it, feeding off the attention, assuming they'd cheer him on like an audience at a twisted play. Then, a shift, a young woman in the crowd, her hands trembling slightly as she held her phone steady, stepped forward. "Hey, officer, I think you should check that ID again." Her voice wavered, but there was a stubborn resolve beneath it, a flicker of courage that cut through the tension. He scoffed, turning to her with a scowl. What are you talking about? Stay out of this." But she pressed on, her tone growing firmer. "Seriously, just look at it," with an exaggerated roll of his eyes. He snatched the ID from the hood, finally deigning to glance at it. His expression shifted, first annoyance, then confusion, then a dawning panic that tightened his grip until his knuckles whitened. His eyes darted back to the woman still in handcuffs, her face unreadable, a statue carved from resilience. No way. "This can't be," he stammered, his voice cracking for the first time, stripped of its earlier bravado. The crowd fell silent, the air thickening with anticipation as he took a step back, suddenly aware of the cameras, the whispers, the weight of his actions crashing down around him. His arrogance melted away, replaced by a raw, visceral fear that twisted his features into something almost pitiful. She tilted her head, the faintest hint of a smile tugging at her lips, a smile that held no warmth, only triumph. "I warned you," she said softly, her words slicing through the silence with more power than his shouts ever could. Without another word, she stepped forward, the clink of the handcuffs a faint echo against the sound of clicking cameras. He didn't stop her. He couldn't. The power had shifted, a seismic reversal that left him exposed, and everyone watching knew it. In that moment, the lesson crystallized just for him, but for all who bore witness. Justice, when wielded by those who understand its true meaning, is a force that cannot be outrun. His abuse of power, rooted in prejudice and ego, had unraveled him, leaving him to face the consequences of his own making. She, Angela Carter, the newly appointed chief of police, had stood in the fire of his arrogance and emerged unscathed, her dignity intact, her authority undeniable. The crowd's murmurs grew into a chorus of realization, the young woman with the phone exchanging wide-eyed glances with an older man beside her, his weathered face creasing with a mix of awe and relief. This wasn't just a personal victory, it was a reckoning. The parking lot, once a stage for his petty tyranny, transformed into a courtroom where the scales of justice tipped decisively in her favor. And as she walked away, the handcuffs still dangling from her wrists like a badge of her endurance, the question lingered in the air. What would she do with the power now firmly in her grasp? The answer, whatever it might be, promised a story of retribution and redemption that would echo far beyond this humid Alabama night, a testament to the enduring truth that those who misuse authority will, in time, answer for it. The precinct hummed with its usual chaos that morning, a symphony of ringing phones, overlapping voices, and the shuffle of boots against linoleum floors. Officers darted between desks, their movements a blur of purpose and routine, while the faint aroma of burnt coffee lingered in the air. Outside, the sun cast a pale light over the asphalt of the restricted parking lot, where Angela's black sedan sat gleaming under the early March sky. She stepped out of the building, her navy suit hugging her frame with sharp precision, her badge clipped unobtrusively to her belt. Each click of her heels against the pavement echoed with the quiet confidence of a woman who had spent years earning her place. She was on a simple errand, grabbing a forgotten file from her car, a task so mundane it barely registered in her packed schedule of meetings with community leaders and updates on sprawling investigations. But in that fleeting moment of ordinary life, the world was about to tilt. Across the lot, Daniel swung his patrol car into its spot, the engine still ticking as he climbed out. His uniform clung to him, slightly wrinkled from hours on the road, a testament to the grind he wore like a badge of honor. To some in the department, he was a rock, unyielding, dependable, a man who kept order when chaos threatened to spill over. To others, he was a loaded gun, his authority wielded with a recklessness that blurred the line between justice and tyranny. He wasn't cruel in the overt, sneering way some might imagine. His prejudice was quieter, a deep-seated current that ran through him, unchecked and unquestioned. It was a bias he carried with the swagger of someone who believed the world bent to his roulette, a belief that had gone unchallenged for far too long. Daniel's life beyond the badge was a study in predictability. Divorced, he lived alone in a modest apartment where the walls were bare save for a faded photo of his old precinct crew. His nights were spent hunched over card tables with a handful of colleagues who shared his worldview, their laughter punctuated by the clink of beer bottles at the dimly lit bar down the street. He saw himself as a man who had the world figured out, a cog in the machine of order, a protector of the way things ought to be. That morning, as he squinted across the lot and spotted Angela by her car, that certainty flickered in his chest, igniting something primal and unexamined. From a distance, she was just a silhouette, a black woman in a crisp suit standing beside a vehicle that gleamed a little too brightly for his liking. His mind raced, stitching together a narrative from threads of assumption. The car was too nice, the suit too polished, her presence in the restricted lot too out of place. He didn't know her, didn't care to. Angela's recent promotion to a senior role had barely rippled through his awareness. He rarely bothered with the administrative side of the force. To him, she wasn't the composed leader navigating the precinct's complexities. She was an anomaly, a challenge to the order he upheld. Without a second thought, he strode toward her, his boots thudding against the asphalt, his voice cutting through the morning air like a blade. "Hey, what are you doing here?" It wasn't a question, it was a command, laced with the weight of a man who expected obedience. Angela turned, her brows lifting slightly in surprise before smoothing into a mask of calm. She offered a polite nod, her voice steady as she began to explain. "I'm just getting something from my car." But Daniel wasn't listening. His eyes narrowed, his stance widening as he fired off questions like bullets. "Whose car is this? Do you have permission to be here? What's your business in this lot?" Each word dripped with suspicion, his tone sharpening with every syllable she uttered in response. She kept her composure, her hands steady at her sides, but inside, a flicker of frustration sparked. She knew who she was: Angela Harris, a woman who had clawed her way through years of scrutiny to stand where she did. Yet here she was, reduced to a stranger in her own domain, her authority stripped away by a man too blind to see beyond his own assumptions. The encounter spiraled faster than either of them could have predicted. Daniel's hand hovered near his belt, his fingers twitching as if itching to escalate. "Step away from the car," he barked, his voice rising over the distant hum of traffic. Angela's pulse quickened, but she complied, stepping back with deliberate slowness, her eyes never leaving his. She wasn't afraid, not yet, but the weight of the moment pressed against her ribs. Passersby slowed their steps, their murmurs rising like a tide. A young woman in a delivery uniform paused, her phone already in hand, capturing the scene as it unfolded. An older man in a janitor's jacket lingered near the precinct entrance, his brow furrowed in unease, but he didn't move closer. Angela felt their stares, a prickling heat creeping up her neck as humiliation sank its teeth into her. Daniel demanded her ID, his tone now a growl of impatience. She handed it over, her fingers brushing the cool plastic as she watched him snatch it without care. He barely glanced at it, just long enough to confirm his suspicions before tossing it onto the hood of her car with a dismissive flick of his wrist. Then, without a word, he began rifling through her belongings, yanking open the sedan's door and digging through the glove box. Papers scattered onto the seat, a pen clattered to the ground, and Angela stood frozen, her breath shallow. The injustice of it burned in her chest, a wildfire threatening to consume her restraint. She wanted to shout, to demand he stop, but she knew the optics knew how quickly this could spin into something uglier. So she stayed silent, her dignity a fragile shield against the storm of his arrogance. The air grew thick with tension as Daniel's hands closed around her wrists, the cold bite of handcuffs snapping into place. She winced, the metal digging into her skin, but her face remained a portrait of quiet resolve. Inside, a tempest ragged danger at the violation, shame at the public spectacle, and a steely resolve to turn this moment into something more. The crowd swelled, their whispers a chorus of shock and curiosity. A teenage boy on a skateboard circled closer, his phone angled to record every second, while a woman in a business suit hesitated, her hand half raised as if to intervene before dropping back to her side. Daniel's grip was unrelenting as he tugged her toward his patrol car, his voice booming over the din. "You need to learn some respect for authority." He didn't know who she was, and Angela made no move to tell him. Let him dig his own grave, she thought, her jaw tightening as she walked with her head high. Inside the precinct, the absence of Angela's steady presence sent ripples through the chaos. Her assistant, a weary young man named Marcus, had watched her step outside minutes earlier. Now, he stood by the window, his stomach twisting as he peered down at the parking lot. The sight of her in cuffs, her suit jacket bunching awkwardly under Daniel's grip, sent a jolt of panic through him. He bolted from the room, his sneakers squeaking against the floor as he raced to find someone he knew could stop this. He collided with a veteran officer in the hallway, a grizzled woman named Claire who had seen decades of precinct drama. "You need to come quick," Marcus stammered, his voice cracking. "It's the chief. Something's wrong out there." Claire's eyes widened, and she followed him without a word, her radio already crackling as she called for backup. By the time they reached the lot, the damage was irreparable. Daniel had loosened the cuffs, but the crowd's footage was already spreading grainy clips of a senior officer treating his own chief like a criminal. Angela stood by her car, brushing off her wrists as Claire approached, her face a mix of fury and apology. "I'm so sorry, Chief," Claire muttered, her voice low. Angela waved her off, her gaze fixed on Daniel as he sauntered back to his patrol car, oblivious to the shift in the air. She didn't speak, but her mind churned with a fierce clarity. This wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had ever felt the sting of unchecked power, every soul diminished by a system that too often shielded the wrongdoers. Back in her office, Angela sat behind her desk, the faint red marks on her wrists a silent testament to the morning's ordeal. She traced them absently, her fingers trembling with a rage she rarely let surface. The humiliation lingered like a bitter taste, but beneath it simmered a purposeful vow to wield her authority not as a weapon, but as a tool for justice. Marcus slipped in, his hands clutching a folder, his eyes darting nervously. "Ma'am," he began, his voice soft. "People are talking. Some saw it, some recorded it." She leaned back, her hands folding together, her silence heavy with intent. "Let them talk," she said finally, her tone as steady as steel. "Whispers don't matter. Accountability does, and we'll get there when the time's right." Down the hall, Daniel slouched at his desk, scrolling through his phone with the casual indifference of a man untouched by consequence. The precinct buzzed around him, but he didn't notice the sidelong glances or the hushed tones that followed him. To him, the morning was a victorious small, satisfying flex of power in a world he believed he controlled. He sipped his coffee, cracked a joke with a nearby colleague, and prepared for his next patrol, blissfully unaware of the reckoning gathering like storm clouds overhead. Justice, when it came, would not be loud or swift. It would be deliberate, unyielding, and deep a lesson carved into the bones of a system that had let power run wild for too long. And Angela, with her quiet strength and unbroken resolve, would be the one to wield it. That afternoon, the precinct hummed with an undercurrent of unease as Angela summoned her department heads to a meeting. The gathering was meant to be a standard briefing, but the air crackled with a tension no one dared name. The conference room, with its long table and rows of chairs, felt smaller than usual, the walls seeming to press inward as the officers filed in. Angela stood at the head of the room, her posture straight as a blade, her dark suit pristine, the badge pinned to her chest catching the harsh fluorescent light. Her face was a mask of control, but beneath it churned a storm of determination and quiet fury. She cleared her throat, and the murmurs died instantly, every pair of eyes locking onto her. Her voice, when she spoke, was steady and deliberate, each syllable falling like a stone into still water. She laid out new policies with precision, her words weaving a tapestry of expectation. Integrity, service to the community. These weren't mere buzzwords, they were a creed she'd staked her career on, and now, her resolve burned brighter than ever. As she addressed the group, her gaze roamed the room, sharp and searching, until it settled for a fleeting moment on Daniel. He sat near the back, arms folded tight across his chest, his jaw set in a line that could have been defiance or unease, maybe both. His eyes met hers briefly, but she didn't linger, didn't call him out. She didn't need to. The weight of her stare carried a message louder than words. I see you. The meeting ended, and the room emptied slowly, officers exchanging glances, but few words. Daniel lingered, his boots scuffing the linoleum as he approached Tyler, a younger officer who'd always idolized him. Tyler stood by the water cooler, his usual boyish grin absent, replaced by a furrowed brow and a fidgeting hand twisting the edge of his uniform sleeve. He looked up as Daniel clapped a hand on his shoulder, the gesture casual but heavy with unspoken strain. Tense room today, huh? Daniel said, forcing a chuckle that sounded hollow even to his own ears. What's got everyone so wound up? Tyler's eyes darted around the room, scanning for eavesdroppers, his voice dropping low. I don't know, man, there's just talk. A lot of it. About the chief. About you. He paused, chewing his lip, the words tumbling out reluctantly. People are saying something's coming. Like fallout from, earlier. Daniel's smile faded, his grip tightening briefly on Tyler's shoulder before he let go. Fallout? He snapped, his tone sharpening with defensiveness. For what? I was doing my job. If people wanted to blow nothing into something, that's on them. Not me. Tyler nodded, quick and uncertain, but his unease clung to him like damp cloth. Yeah, sure. Just be careful, all right? Things can spiral fast around here. Daniel waved him off with a scoff, brushing the warning aside like a pesky fly, but as he turned away, a splinter of doubt lodged itself deep in his mind, sharp and nagging. Meanwhile, Angela wasted no time. She retreated to her office, the door clicking shut behind her, and set to work with the precision of a surgeon. She met with her legal team, their voices a low murmur as they pored over policies and procedures, every clause dissected and every loophole sealed. She sifted through stacks of evidence reports, timestamps, witness accounts, her fingers tracing lines of text as if they were battle plans. Beyond the precinct walls, she reached out to community leaders, her tone warm but resolute as she secured their trust, and consulted with allies she'd cultivated over years of quiet, steady work. This wasn't just about settling a score, it was about carving a legacy. She wasn't merely reacting, she was building a fortress of justice, brick by deliberate brick, ensuring that when the hammer fell, it would strike true. The lesson was clear, power unchecked was a poison, and she'd be the antidote. As evening draped the city in shadow, Daniel found himself alone in the locker room. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting stark shadows across the rows of dented metal lockers. He leaned against one, the cold steel biting through his shirt, and replayed Tyler's words in his head. The meeting flashed back to Angela's measured tone, the way her eyes had pinned him in place, the subtle chill in how colleagues had sidestepped him all day. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty ignited in his chest, a tiny flame he tried to smother with bravado. It's nothing, he told himself, clenching his fists until his knuckles whitened. They're overreacting. I'm fine. But the silence around him pressed harder, thick and suffocating, and the doubt refused to fade. Across the precinct, Angela remained in her office long after the last officer had clocked out. The city skyline glittered through her window, a mosaic of lights against the darkening sky. While the hum of the building settled into a quiet drone, she leaned back in her chair, the leather creaking softly, and tilted her head to stare at the ceiling. Her mind raced, mapping out the days ahead, every move, every counterstrike. She knew the path to justice was a jagged one, strewn with obstacles and resistance. But she'd walked it before. Her resolve was ironclad, forged in years of watching power twist and corrupt. This wasn't just about Daniel. It was about the system he'd exploited, the cracks she'd vowed to mend. The stage was set, and she held the truth in her hands, a weapon sharper than any blade. Days later, the precinct lay cloaked in an eerie stillness, a hush that felt less like calm and more like the breath held before a scream. Angela's plan had crystallized, and the weight of her role as chief pressed down on her shoulders like a mantle of stone. She stood in her office one final time, flipping through the documents that would cement her stand letters, reports, a paper trail of accountability that stretched beyond the precinct's walls. This wasn't just a reprimand, it was a declaration. The time for hints and sidelong glances was over. What came next would echo through the department, a ripple of consequence that would outlast them all. The main conference room filled slowly, officers trickling in with muted footsteps and hushed voices. The air was thick with anticipation, a stew of nerves and curiosity simmering beneath the surface. Daniel claimed a seat near the back, his arms crossed again, his posture a study in forced nonchalance, but his mind was far from steady. The whispers about the parking lot incident had swelled in the days since, louder, more pointed. He'd felt the shift, the way eyes slid away from his, the way conversations stuttered to a halt when he approached. It gnawed at him, the slow unraveling of the confidence he'd worn like armor. Had he misjudged? Had he pushed too far? Angela entered, and the room snapped to silence. Her presence filled the space, a quiet authority that needed no fanfare. Her suit was crisp, her badge a gleaming emblem of her duty, and she moved to the front with the grace of someone who'd never known hesitation. Her eyes swept the room, steady and unflinching, and the tension coiled tighter. A spring wound to breaking. When she spoke, her voice was a calm blade, cutting through the haze. She began with the department's core integrity, fairness, the oath they'd all sworn to uphold. Her words weren't rushed, they landed with purpose, sinking into the silence like roots into soil. She spoke of accountability, not as an abstract ideal, but as a living promissetto of the community. To each other, the room held its breath, every officer leaning in, caught in the gravity of her conviction. Then she paused, letting the quiet stretch, a deliberate beat that sharpened the edge of what came next. Last week, she said, her tone unwavering, an incident took place right here, in this precinct. An incident that never should have happened. One that exposes the very flaws we claim to stand against. The air grew heavy, the words pressing down on every listener. Daniel shifted in his seat, his casual facade cracking as a bead of sweat traced his temple. He felt the room shrink, the walls closing in as Angela's gaze swung toward him, piercing and direct. "Officer Whitaker," she said, her voice ringing clear, "would you please stand?" The silence roared in his ears. Daniel hesitated, his heart thudding against his ribs, his mind scrambling for an escape, but there was none. Slowly, he rose, his chair scraping the floor with a sound that echoed like a gunshot. His face flickered between confusion and defiance, a storm brewing behind his eyes. Angela stepped closer, her expression calm but unyielding, a judge delivering a verdict. "Do you recall an incident in the parking lot last week?" she asked. "An interaction with someone you assumed was trespassing?" His throat tightened, a lump he couldn't swallow. He wanted to dodge, to deflect, to turn the question back on her, but the weight of every stare pinned him in place. I remember," he said at last, his voice a shadow of its usual bravado. Angela nodded, her eyes locked on his. "And did you verify their identity? Did you stop to consider you might have been wrong?" The questions were simple, but they cut deep, exposing the reckless certainty he'd clung to. He opened his mouth, grasping for a defense. "I thought I was doing my job," he stammered, the words brittle and desperate. "I didn't know." "You didn't know," Angela interrupted, her tone slicing through his excuse like a whip, "because you didn't bother to find out. You saw what you wanted to see and acted without a shred of care." That's not duty, that's abuse. The accusation hung there, raw and unanswerable. A mirror held up to his choices. Daniel's face burned, anger and shame warring within him. He wanted to shout, to justify, to claw back the control slipping through his fingers. But a deeper truth gnawed at him. She was right. He'd acted on impulse, on arrogance, and now the reckoning had arrived. Angela turned to the room, her voice steady as steel. This isn't about one mistake. It's about a culture that lets power run wild, that turns a blind eye until it's too late. We can't claim to serve and protect if we don't hold ourselves to account. She faced Daniel again, her gaze a lance. Officer Whitaker, effective immediately. You're suspended without pay pending a full investigation. This department won't tolerate actions that erode trust or tarnish our mission. The words settled over the room like dust after an explosion, heavy and final. Daniel stood frozen, the weight of consequence crashing down, while Angela's resolve shone brighter, a beacon of justice, a warning of what happened when power forgot its purpose. The storm had broken, and neither of them would leave it unscathed. In the dim, flickering light of the precinct locker room, Daniel stood motionless, his broad shoulders hunched as though the ceiling itself pressed down on him. The cold reality of his circumstances seeped into his bones like a bitter winter chill. He could feel the urge to fight back bubbling inside him, a desperate need to shout his innocence or fling accusations to deflect the blame. But the evident chest arc, unyielding and painfully clear, held him in a vice grip, silencing any protest before it could form. Around him, the usual hum of the precinct had dulled to a murmur, soft whispers threading through the air like threads of a fraying tapestry. The officers who typically filled the space with boisterous laughter and casual banter now exchanged hushed words, their eyes darting toward him before skittering away, as if his shame were contagious. Across the room, Angela moved with a quiet, unshakable grace. She didn't linger for his response, it didn't need to. With a final glance that carried the weight of a judge's gavel, she turned on her heel and strode out, her boots clicking against the tiled floor in a rhythm that echoed with purpose. Her head remained high, her posture a silent declaration of resolve. She understood that this moment was merely the opening chapter of a grueling saga. The path ahead loomed dark and treacherous, paved with skepticism from her peers and resistance from those who clung to the old ways. Yet, deep in her core, she carried a certainty that burned brighter than the obstacles. Justice wasn't a matter of ease or personal comfort. It demanded sacrifice, a willingness to stand firm even when the ground beneath trembled. For Angela, this wasn't just a job, it was a calling, a vow to right the wrongs that festered in the shadows of power. Meanwhile, Daniel remained rooted where he stood, a statue carved from regret and disbelief. The consequences of his actions pressed against his chest, heavy as a leaden shroud. For years, he'd worn his badge like armor, shielding himself from doubt or introspection. Now, stripped bare by the day's events, he faced an unfamiliar mirror. His bias, those quiet, insidious whispers he'd never questioned, stared back at him, their damage laid out in vivid, unrelenting detail. The lives he'd altered, the trust he'd shattered, the arrogance he'd wielded like a weapon, all of it crashed over him in waves. If he wanted any hope of salvaging his career, his life, he'd have to claw his way out of this pit, brick by painful brick. The air in the precinct hung thick with tension long after the meeting dissolved, a silent testament to the reckoning that had unfolded, a reminder that justice, when it arrived, spared no one. Back in her office, Angela settled into her chair, the faint hum of the city filtering through the window behind her. Her mind churned, already mapping out the next moves in this intricate chess game. The fight for fairness was a marathon, not a sprint, and she knew the road ahead would test her endurance. But she was ready, steely, unwavering, her spirit forged in the fires of countless battles. The real question gnawed at her: would Daniel rise to meet this challenge, or would he and the department he represented collapse under the weight of their own flaws? As the precinct emptied out, its corridors growing still, Daniel found himself alone in the locker room. The metallic clatter of his badge hitting the bench reverberated through the space, a sound sharper and more accusing than he'd expected. His hands shook as he dragged them through his sweat-dampened hair, frustration and humiliation warring within him. In a single afternoon, he'd been laid bare, called out in front of his colleagues, his authority stripped away like peeling paint. Over and over, his mind replayed the scene, Angela's piercing stare, the unshakable conviction in her voice, the suffocating silence of the room as every eye bore witness to his fall. It was a weight he couldn't shake, a noose tightening with every breath. The soft tap of footsteps yanked him from his spiraling thoughts. He turned, his heart lurching as Angela appeared in the doorway, her silhouette framed by the dim hallway light. Even now, her presence commanded the room, though her face remained an enigma neither soft nor harsh, just unreadable. Instinctively, he straightened, his defenses snapping into place like a soldier bracing for battle. "Chief," he muttered, his voice tight, clinging to the frayed edges of his pride. She stepped inside, closing the door with a deliberate click that seemed to seal them in a bubble of confrontation. She didn't sit, didn't waver, her gaze locking onto his with an intensity that made the silence between them crackle. When she finally spoke, her words sliced through the air with quiet force. "You don't get it, do you?" Daniel's brow furrowed, irritation flaring in his chest. "What's there to get?" He shot back, his tone rising despite himself. "You made your point loud and clear, in front of everyone. Congratulations, you won." Angela's eyes narrowed, a flicker of something raw breaking through her calm facade. "This isn't about winning, Daniel," she said, her voice sharpening like a honed blade. "It's about accountability, about the harm you've caused, whether you're man enough to face it or not." He scoffed, shaking his head as if he could dismiss her words with the gesture. "Harm? I was doing my job. You're the one who stood there acting like the rules don't apply to you. How was I supposed to know who you were?" Her response came swift and fierce, cutting through his defiance. "You did know because you didn't bother to ask. You didn't pause for a single second to question your assumptions. You just acted." She took a step closer, her voice dropping to a searing whisper. "Do you have any idea what that feels like, Daniel? To be reduced to nothing more than someone's snap judgment. To have your dignity ripped away because someone with a badge decided you didn't belong?" Her words hung in the air, heavy and unyielding, and for a moment, Daniel faltered. His mouth opened, then closed, his thoughts a tangled mess. She pressed on, her tone softening but losing none of its gravity. "You think this is just about me, about that parking lot. It's not. It's about every person who stood where I stood, who didn't have a voice or a rank to push back. You've done this before, haven't you? Assumed, acted, judged because you thought you could. How many times, Daniel? How many lives have you brushed aside without a second thought?" Her words cracked something inside him, a fissure running through the wall he'd built around himself. His voice trembled as he replied, "I never thought about it like that." Angela's expression softened, just a fraction, but her resolve held firm. "That's the problem. You didn't think. You acted out of ignorance, out of arrogance, and now the bills come due. You've got a lot to wrestle with, Danielle, not just what happened last week, but who you are at your core. The man you were in that parking lot, he doesn't belong here." His shoulders sagged, her words sinking into him like stones into still water. For the first time, he glimpsed himself through her ice through the eyes of everyone he'd wronged, and the image was ugly, distorted, a far cry from the hero he'd once imagined himself to be. "I don't know how to fix this," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Angela studied him, her gaze thoughtful, weighing his confession. "Fixing it isn't about empty promises or grand gestures," she said. "It's about the work, listening, learning, proving with every step that you're different. I can't map that out for you, Daniel. That's your burden to carry, your path to find." She turned to leave, pausing with her hand on the doorknob. "You've been given a chance, a rare one. Most people in your shoes don't get that. Use it well, or don't. It's up to you." The door clicked shut behind her, the sound reverberating in the empty room like a final punctuation mark. Daniel sank onto the bench, his mind a storm of regret and revelation. For the first time, he felt the full weight of his flaws, not just as an officer, but as a man. In the sprawling, unseen consequences of his choices stretched out before him like a shadowed horizon. In her office, Angela leaned back in her chair, the city's glow painting faint streaks of light across her desk. Beneath her composed exterior, a tempest of emotions swirled. She wasn't angry at it anymore. She was exhausted, bone-deep weary from the endless fight. from the constant need to prove her worth in a world that too often refused to see it. Yet amid the fatigue burned a fierce purpose. This wasn't just about Daniel, or even herself. It was about planting a flag in the ground, about forging a legacy of accountability that would outlast her. The precinct lay silent that night, its halls steeped in the echoes of the day's upheaval. The story was far from finished. Countless steps and conversations lay ahead. But as Angela gazed out at the city lights, she allowed herself a single, steadying breath, bolstered by the knowledge that she'd set something vital in motion, a ripple of justice that could one day become a wave. The weight of that day didn't dissipate as the precinct slipped back into its routine. It lingered, an unspoken presence felt in every quiet exchange, every cautious glance. The officers who had witnessed Angela's stand replayed it in their minds, some struck by a sudden clarity about the cost of unchecked power, others bristling at the shift in a world they'd long taken for granted. For Daniel, the echoes followed him home to his cramped, dimly lit apartment. The walls seemed to close in, amplifying the tumult in his head. His suspension stretched before him, an expanse of empty time he didn't know how to fill. At his kitchen table, a cold coffee sat untouched, his badge glinting dully beside it. Once a symbol of pride, it now mocked him, a relic of a self he could no longer recognize. He scrolled through his phone, seeking distraction. But the world beyond the precinct had caught wind of his disgrace. Whispers turned to rumors, then to shaky videos splashed across social media, grainy footage of that parking lot moment, a public unraveling he couldn't escape. Each ping of his phone tightened the knot in his chest, a reminder that justice, once awakened, spared no one, not even him. The video had erupted across the internet like wildfire, igniting a storm of discussion that Daniel never could have foreseen. He sat alone in his dimly lit apartment, the faint hum of the city filtering through the cracked window. As he scrolled through the endless barrage of comments on his screen, the words were sharp, cutting deep. People didn't just condemn him. They tore apart the very system that had shielded him for so long, a culture that turned a blind eye to men like him. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, itching to type a defense, to scream that the footage was only a sliver of the truth, a distorted glimpse of a single moment. But as the night wore on, the glow of the monitor casting shadows across his tired face, a gnawing realization settled in his chest. What the world saw was enough. It wasn't everything, but it was enough to damn him. Across town, Angela stood in the precinct's break room, the bitter scent of burnt coffee lingering in the air as she stared at the cracked linoleum floor. The public's reaction to the leaked video had crashed over her like a tidal wave, praise from some, venom from others, a relentless flood of voices that left her reeling. Her phone buzzed incessantly on the counter, messages from community leaders stacking up like bricks in a wall she couldn't climb. Some lauded her courage, their words warm with gratitude for a woman bold enough to confront the rot within her ranks. Others, though, sharpened their tongues, questioning if her actions were too timid, too laddie, a half measure when the moment demanded a reckoning. Inside the department, the air grew thick with tension. Officers shuffled past her in the halls, their eyes averted or narrowed with resentment, whispering among themselves that she'd betrayed one of their own. Yet in quieter corners, a few met her gaze with nods of silent approval, their relief palpably, leader willing to face the ugliness they'd all pretended not to see. Later that day, Angela sat at the head of a long, scuffed conference table, her legal team and senior staff flanking her like sentinels. The room buzzed with the low hum of fluorescent lights, the walls lined with faded certificates and photos of a department that had once prided itself on unity. She laid out the plan with a voice that cut through the murmur. Daniel's investigation was in full swing, and she wouldn't let it fester in the shadows. Every step, every finding, every consequence would be laid bare for the public to see. "We can't just talk about accountability," she said, her tone steady as steel, her hands clasped tightly on the table. "If we mean to change anything, we have to prove it. Prove we're not afraid to face the mess, even when it stings." Her words hung heavy, a challenge to everyone in the room, including herself. As the meeting dissolved and voices faded into the hall, one figure remained: Lieutenant Parker, a grizzled veteran whose lined face carried the weight of decades on the force. He lingered by the door, his broad shoulders slouched slightly. A man who'd weathered storms, but never stopped bracing for the next. Parker approached her slowly, his boots scuffing against the worn carpet. His voice a low rumble as he spoke. "You've stirred up a hell of a tide, Chief. Good tide, if you ask me, but it's a tide all the same." His eyes, sharp beneath bushy brows, searched hers with a mix of caution and admiration. "Not everyone's ready for this. Some'll fight it tooth and nail quietly, maybe, but they won't just roll over." Angela straightened, meeting his stare without flinching, her jaw set firm. "I didn't take this job to win popularity contests, Parker. I'm here for what's right, and if that means rocking the boat, then I'll keep rocking it." He gave a slow nod, respect flickering in his weathered features, though worry lingered in the creases around his mouth. "Just keep your eyes open," he muttered, turning to leave. "Change like this, it's a beast. Not everyone's rooting for you." His words echoed in her mind long after he'd gone. A warning she didn't need but appreciated all the same. She'd faced pushback before and knew its sting, and she'd face it again. Justice wasn't a gentle pursuit. It was a jagged, uphill climb, but one she'd never abandon. For Daniel, time blurred into a haze of restless days, suspended from duty. He drifted through his small apartment like a ghost, avoiding the bars and diners where he'd once been a regular. He could already feel the weight of the stairs, hear the hushed voices trailing him like shadows. Instead, he holed up with his laptop, the screen's blue light his only companion as he dove into articles and videos he'd never bothered with before, pieces on systemic bias, the tangled history of policing, the cracks in a system he'd once thought unbreakable. At first, it felt like a sentence, a bitter pill forced down his throat by a world that had turned on him. He bristled at every word, every accusation, his mind racing to justify himself. But as the hours stretched into days, something shifted. The stories he read off lives upended, of voices ignored began to pierce through his defenses, settling into his bones like a cold truth he couldn't shake. He saw himself reflected not as the wronged man he'd imagined, but as part of the problem, a cog in a machine he'd never questioned. One chilly evening, Daniel found himself parked outside a modest community center, its brick facade weathered, but warm under the glow of streetlights. The sign out front was hand-painted, advertising workshops on equity and accountability in law enforcement, a call to action. He hadn't planned to answer. He sat in his car, engine off, the silence pressing against him as his hand hovered over the door handle. Why was he here? Guilt gnawed at him, sharp and relentless, but there was more: curiosity, maybe, or a flicker of something deeper, a desperate need to claw his way toward something better. With a shaky breath, he pushed the door open and stepped into the night, the cold biting at his skin as he crossed the threshold. Inside, the room was small but alive, filled with a patchwork of face locals in worn coats, a handful of off-duty officers in plain clothes, all gathered around folding tables littered with coffee cups and flyers. A young activist stood at the front, her voice ringing with fire and clarity as she spoke of reform, of pain, of hope. Daniel lingered near the back, arms crossed, his pulse quickening as he braced for judgment. At first, he wanted to argue, to push back against every word she flung into the air. But as the stories unfolded, unfiltered accounts of hurt and resilience, as walls began to crack, and by the time the night ended, he felt a quiet, unfamiliar weight, humility. Back at the precinct, Angela wrestled with the fallout. The investigation into Daniel's conduct was nearing its end, and the results sprawled across her desk in a thick, damning report. It wasn't just the parking lot incident that had sparked this mess. There were other complaints, other moments where his choices had veered into darkness, threads of a pattern she couldn't ignore. She sat alone in her office, the city's skyline sprawling beyond the window, her fingers tracing the edges of the pages as a heaviness settled in her chest. This wasn't just about one man, it was about the soul of her department, about proving that power unchecked would always breed ruin. When the final meeting arrived, the air in the conference room crackled with tension, thick enough to choke on. Angela sat tall at the table's head, her team arrayed around her, while Daniel faced her from the opposite end, his face pale but resolute. He'd read the report, knew the axe was falling, and yet he'd come, shoulders squared, ready to meet his fate. Her voice broke the silence, firm but laced with a trace of sorrow. "Officer Whitaker, We've dug deep into this, and we've done it fairly. The evidence is clear. Your actions show a pattern that can't stand. As chief, it's my duty to hold this department to a standard to protect what we're supposed to be. Your time here ends today." The words landed like a hammer, and Daniel flinched. Though he'd braced himself for them, he swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper but steady. "Thank you for letting me face it head on. I've got a long road ahead, a lot to figure out. But I'm going to try." Angela watched him, her stern gaze softening just a fraction. "I hope you mean that, Daniel. This doesn't have to define you, it's what you do next that will." He rose, the chair scraping against the floor, and left the room with a storm of emotions churning inside him: grief for what he'd lost, shame for what he'd done, and a fragile spark of something new, something like resolve. Days later, Daniel sat in a corner booth at a diner on the edge of Birmingham, the clatter of dishes and hum of voices swirling around him. His coffee had gone cold, untouched, as he clutched a folded letter, the official notice of his termination, Angela's signature slashing across the bottom like a final verdict. He'd read it over and over, each word a stone sinking into his gut, a wall rising between the man he'd been and the one he'd have to become. Across the city, Angela stood in her office, gazing out at the streets below. The precinct hushed in a stillness that felt more like a pause than peace. Her desk was a battlefield of papers, reports, memos, letters from the community, some brimming with hope, others dripping with rage. She'd pored over every one, even the ones that stung, because they kept her grounded, reminded her why she fought. A knock broke her reverie, and Parker stepped in, his weathered face etched with exhaustion and quiet strength. He held a coffee in one hand, a folder in the other, and sank into the chair across from her with a sigh. "You're carrying the world, Chief," he said, his voice a gravelly murmur. "Thought you might need someone to take a piece of it." She smiled faintly, her eyes tired but fierce, knowing the lesson etched into every step of this ordeal. Justice demanded sacrifice and power. When abused, left scars that rippled far beyond the guilty. The weariness clung to Angela like a second skin, an unshakable burden that came with the territory of her role. She felt it in the ache of her shoulders, the dull throb behind her eyes, and the way every step seemed to demand more effort than the last. Parker, her steadfast deputy, watched her with a knowing look as he stood across the cluttered office, the faint hum of the precinct buzzing beyond the walls. "You know as well as I do," he said, his voice steady but laced with concern. "This exhaustion, it's part of the gig." He set the folder he'd been holding onto her desk with a soft thud, the sound reverberating in the quiet space between them. "But I'll be honest, Angela, it doesn't get any lighter. I've watched leaders come and go, some tough, some brilliant, but you've got more grit in you than most of them combined. That's something. Still, grit's only half the battle. You've got to look after yourself, too." Angela's lips curved into a faint, tired smile, her eyes meeting his for a fleeting moment. His words were a lifeline, a rare acknowledgement of the storm she weathered daily, though they did little to lift the weight pressing down on her chest. "I'll rest when the job's done," she murmured, her voice soft but resolute, a quiet vow she'd made to herself long ago. Parker leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight, and studied her with the kind of scrutiny that only came from years of trust. "Thing is, Chief," he said, his tone gentle yet unyielding, "the work never ends. That's the ugly truth of it. But here's another truth: you don't have to haul it all on your own shoulders." For a moment, Angela let his words sink in, her guarded expression softening as she looked at him, really looked at him. Parker had been her rock through countless late nights and impossible decisions, a man who understood the jagged edges of leadership, the sacrifices it carved out of you. His graying hair caught the dim light, and the lines etched into his face told stories of battles fought long before she'd taken the helm. "Thank you, Parker," she said, her voice carrying a sincerity that surprised even her. "I mean that." He gave a small nod, rising to his feet and scooping up the folder once more. "You've got me in your corner, Chief," he said as he moved toward the door. "Whatever's coming next, you're not facing it solo." The door clicked shut behind him, leaving Angela alone in the stillness of her office. She leaned back in her chair, the worn cushion groaning under her weight, and let her eyelids flutter shut. In that rare sliver of vulnerability, Her mind wandered to Daniel, his face flashing before her, the raw pain in his eyes as he'd accepted his suspension weeks ago. She could still see the way his shoulders had slumped, the defiance warring with defeat as he'd walked out of this very room. Then came the faces of the community members who'd sat across from her, their voices trembling with courage as they recounted tales of mistrust and betrayal at the hands of officers she was now tasked with reshaping. The responsibility was a towering, relentless thing, but Angela knew faltering wasn't an option. Justice demanded more than good intentions. It required unrelenting resolve, a lesson she carried like a torch through the darkness. Meanwhile, across town, Daniel stood at a crossroads of his own making. The days following his suspension had stretched into weeks, each one a slow unraveling of the man he'd thought himself to be. At first, the sting of anger and bitterness had consumed him sharp and biting, a fire that roared in his chest. But as time wore on, that fire dulled into something quieter, heavier, a nagging uncertainty that gnawed at him in the stillness. He found himself drawn to the community center, a squat brick building tucked between a bodega and a laundromat, its walls humming with the voices of people he'd once dismissed. He attended workshops there, sat in folding chairs under flickering fluorescent lights, and listened to stories that echoed his own in ways he hadn't expected. He didn't say much, preferring the safety of silence, but the words of others began to seep into the cracks of his defenses, chipping away at the fortress he'd built around his pride. One evening, after a session that had left the room buzzing with emotion, Daniel lingered as the others filed out into the dusk. The facilitator, a young woman named Maya, stood near the front, gathering her notes. Her presence was striking, calm yet commanding, her dark eyes sharp with an empathy that reminded him, uncomfortably, of Angela. Maya had shared her own story earlier that night, her voice steady as she described being profiled by law enforcement, the humiliation and rage it had sparked in her. That familiarity, that quiet strength, tugged at something deep within Daniel, urging him forward despite the knot in his stomach. He approached her hesitantly, his boots scuffing against the worn linoleum. "Can I ask you something?" he said, his voice rough, uncertain. Maya turned to him, her gaze unwavering but kind. "Of course," she replied, setting her papers down with a deliberate gentleness. Daniel swallowed hard, the question clawing its way out of him. How do you move past it? The anger, the frustration, how do you let it go? She studied him for a long moment, her expression thoughtful, as though she were weighing the depth of his words. Then she spoke, her voice clear and measured. "You don't just let it go, Daniel. You take it, all that anger, all that frustration, and you turn it into something else. You channel it into building something better, something that matters. It's not about erasing what happened to you. It's about making damn sure it doesn't keep happening to someone else." Her words landed like stones in still water, rippling through him long after she'd finished speaking. For the first time, Daniel glimpsed a way forward, not a path to win back the approval of others, but a chance to mend the fractured pieces of himself he hadn't even known were broken. He left the center that night with Maya's voice echoing in his mind, the cool evening air brushing against his skin as he walked the empty streets, lost in thought. Back at the precinct, Angela pressed on, each day a grueling marathon of challenges and fleeting victories. She met with community leaders in cramped meeting rooms, their faces a mix of hope and skepticism as they debated her proposals. She sat through training sessions, watching officers shift uncomfortably in their seats as she outlined new policies, rooted in transparency and accountability. The work was slow, maddeningly so, and the resistance was a constant undertow threatening to drag her under. Yet there were signs of progress, small, fragile glimmers that kept her going. Officers who'd once bristled at her reforms began to nod in reluctant agreement, their guarded expressions softening. Community members who'd eyed her with suspicion started to offer cautious nods of support, their voices joining hers in the fight for something better. One afternoon, as Angela pored over a report detailing the department's halting progress, a shadow fell across her doorway. She looked up to see Daniel standing there, his posture rigid yet uncertain, like a man stepping onto unfamiliar ground. Her breath caught for a moment, a flicker of surprise mingling with wariness as she took him in. "Officer Witt," she said, her voice calm but edged with curiosity as she gestured for him to enter. "Or should I say Mr. Whitaker now?" Daniel stepped inside, his hands clasped tightly in front of him, as though anchoring himself against the tide of his own nerves. "I wanted to thank you," he began, his voice steady but threaded with something raw, vulnerable, "for holding me accountable, for giving me the space to see what I couldn't before." Angela leaned back in her chair, her eyes narrowing as she searched his face for any hint of pretense. But there was none, just a man stripped bare by his own reckoning. "What changed?" she asked, her tone even but probing. Daniel drew a deep breath, meeting her gaze with a resolve she hadn't seen in him before. "I did. Or I'm trying to. These past few weeks, I've been listening, learning, trying to wrap my head around the damage I've done. It's not easy, and I know it doesn't wipe away what happened. But I want to be better, not for you, not for anyone else, but for me." Her expression softened, though her scrutiny didn't waver. "That's a beginning, Daniel," she said, her voice firm yet tinged with something like hope. "But words are cheap. The real test is in what you do day after day, choice after choice. It's about proving you've learned something from the mess you made." He nodded, his jaw tightening with determination. "I know," he said quietly, "and I'm ready to put in the work, whatever it takes." The silence that followed was thick with meaning, a shared understanding settling between them. Angela felt a spark of optimism, not just for Daniel, but for the fragile possibility of transformation, for the chance to forge something enduring out of the wreckage of their struggles. As he turned to leave, she returned to her desk, her resolve burning brighter than ever. The path ahead was treacherous, riddled with obstacles, but they were inching toward something real. Something just. Weeks bled into one another, the fallout from the precinct's upheaval lingering like a stubborn fog. For Daniel, the community center became a lifeline, pulling him deeper into a journey he hadn't anticipated. What had started as a grudging attempt to face his flaws blossomed into a quiet hunger to understand, to grow, to give back to a system he'd once coasted through blindly. Each session stripped away another layer of his old self, revealing truths he'd spent years dodging. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of amber and violet, Daniel sat with Maya in the center's small library. The room was hushed, the shelves sagging under the weight of worn books, the air thick with the scent of paper and dust. They'd just wrapped up a workshop, and the last attendees had trickled out, leaving them alone in the fading light. Maya broke the silence first, her voice cutting through the stillness like a blade. "You've changed," she said simply, her tone free of accusation, heavy with observation. Daniel's brow furrowed, his fingers tightening around the edge of his chair as he wrestled with her words. "I don't know if I'd call it change," he replied, his voice low, introspective. "Maybe I'm just waking up to things I've ignored for too long." Maya tilted her head, her dark hair catching the last rays of sunlight streaming through the window. "That's where it starts," she said, her gaze piercing yet warm. "Seeing the world for what it is, owning up to your part in it, that's the spark. But change, that's what comes next. It's what you build with that clarity." Her words hit him like a quiet thunderclap, resonating deep within. He leaned back, his mind drifting to the years he'd spent wearing a badge, convinced he'd had it all figured out. "I used to think I knew everything," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thought I understood what it meant to protect, to serve. But now I see how much I miss it, how much I didn't even bother to look for." Maya leaned forward, her elbows resting on her knees, her expression a blend of compassion and steel. "The toughest part isn't admitting you were wrong," she said. "It's sticking with the hard stuff, pushing forward even when it's messy, even when no one's there to pat you on the back. So tell me, Daniel, are you ready for that?" He hesitated, the weight of her question pressing down on him like a physical force. Then, slowly, he nodded, his voice quiet but unwavering. "I think I am. I don't know where to begin, but I know I can't go back to who I was." A faint smile tugged at Maya's lips, a spark of encouragement lighting her face in the dim room. "That's as good a starting point as any," she said, her words a quiet promise of possibility. Across the city, Angela waged her own war, steering the department through a sea of resistance and fragile hope. Her reforms were taking root, tendrils of change curling through the precinct, but the pushback was relentless. Meetings with wary officers stretched into hours, their crossed arms and tight-lipped stares a silent challenge. Tense exchanges with community leaders left her drained, their guarded optimism a fragile thread she clung to. The pressure to prove herself to show that justice could prevail over corruption was a constant drumbeat in her chest. Yet amidst the grind, there were moments that fueled her. An email from a rookie cop, his words clumsy but earnest, thanking her for a training session that had opened his eyes. It was a small victory, but it was enough to keep her fighting. The story of Angela and Daniel wasn't just one of personal redemption, it was a testament to the slow, brutal grind of justice, a reminder that power unchecked could hollow out even the strongest souls. Angela's unyielding pursuit of accountability, Daniel's faltering steps toward atonement, and Maya's quiet wisdom wove together a fragile tapestry of hope. The consequences of their past mistakes lingered, but so did the chance to rebuild not just themselves, but the fractured world they inhabited. As the days marched on, the echo of their choices reverberated, a quiet promise that from the ashes of failure, something enduring could rise. The email popped into Angela's inbox late one evening, its brevity masking the depth of emotion woven into every word. It was a heartfelt note from a young recruit, overflowing with gratitude for the space she'd cultivated, a space where accountability wasn't just a buzzword and personal growth wasn't an afterthought. He poured out how the training session had jolted him awake, peeling back layers of bias he hadn't even known clung to him like a second skin. His resolve to evolve into a better officer radiated through the screen, each sentence pulsing with earnest determination. Angela lingered over the message, reading it once, then twice, letting it settle into her bones. A faint smile tugged at her lips, soft but real, as warmth bloomed in her chest. It was a quiet affirmation that transformation, however painstakingly slow, wasn't a pipe dream. It was tangible, possible, worth every ounce of effort. Days later, Angela stepped into the familiar hum of the community center, a place Daniel had been haunting lately with a regularity that surprised her. She'd been asked to speak at an ongoing series bridging the chasm between law enforcement and the people they served, a dialogue she'd navigated before. But this time, the air felt charged different. The room buzzed with a tapestry of voiceless activists with fire in their eyes, community leaders with weathered wisdom, everyday folks wrestling with worry or hope, and a handful of officers, some drawn by curiosity, others dragged by duty. As she climbed the stage, her heart thudded a steady rhythm against her ribs. Her eyes swept the crowd, catching Daniel's near the back. Their gazes locked for a fleeting second, and something flickered in his face, something raw, unguarded, not the old arrogance she'd once known, but a quiet humility, a readiness to hear. It steadied her, fueled her. She took a breath and let her truth spill out. Her voice cut through the room, steady and clear, as she laid bare the wounds that had festered too long between the badge and the street Spain. Distrust, a history of broken promises. She didn't shy away from her own story, tracing the jagged edges of her path as a black woman in a system that too often turned its back on people who mirrored her reflection. She spoke of stumbles, of systemic failures, of the sleepless nights spent wrestling with how to make it right. Her words carried the weight of experience, unpolished and unflinching, as she outlined the steps she'd clawed into place to hold herself and others accountable. The silence in the room was thick, almost reverent, her honesty slicing through pretense like a blade. When she finished, the air hung heavy for a moment, a shared inhale from a crowd suspended in thought. Then, slowly, hands came together, tentative at first, then steady. It wasn't a roaring ovation, but it was real, a ripple of respect for the guts it took to stand there and strip the truth bare. As the evening unwound, Angela wove through the thinning crowd, fielding questions with patience and soaking in stories with an ear that never rushed. Faces blurred into a mosaic of hope and frustration until she found herself standing before Daniel. The space between them crackled with all they hadn't said, a tension that pressed against her chest. He broke it first, his voice low, almost uncertain. That was powerful. He managed, sincerity threading through the hesitation. "Thank you for saying what needed to be heard." Angela studied him, her face a mask as she weighed his words. Then, softly, "Thank you for listening, Daniel. That's where it begins, with listening. What followed wasn't just small talk. It was a bridge. They spoke of his unraveling, how he'd been picking apart old habits, stitching together new ones, and she met him with encouragement where his efforts shone, candor where they faltered. By night's end, an unspoken pact settled between them, a mutual vow to keep pushing forward. The community center emptied into the night, its walls still humming with the echo of what had transpired, a fragile testament that words could spark something enduring. For Angela, that night was a touchstone, a reminder of why she dug her heels into this fight. Justice wasn't just an ideal, it was a lifeline. For Daniel, it was a pivot, a chance to claw his way toward redemption, to prove he could rise above the man he'd been. As they parted, the city stretched out before them, its lights casting long, jagged shadows across the pavement, a silent promise that the road ahead would twist and bruise. But it was one they could walk, and for the first time in ages, a thread of hope stitched itself into their resolve. Fragile but defiant against the weight of doubt, months rolled by, and the city began to shift beneath Angela's feet. The reforms she'd bled for were taking root, not in a blaze of glory, but in the slow, stubborn way change always comes. Training sessions were torn down and rebuilt, policies scratched out and redrafted, and the precinct's air thickened with something new. Accountability wasn't just a slogan anymore. It was a pulse. It wasn't flawless perfection was a myth, but it was progress, and that was enough to keep her going. One afternoon, she stood at her office window, gazing out at the sprawling skyline she'd sworn to protect. The burden she carried hadn't vanished, but it sat lighter on her shoulders, buoyed by the quiet victories stacking up behind her. A knock broke her reverie. Her assistant, a weary woman with a knack for reading the room, stood in the doorway, a thick envelope in hand and a knowing smile tugging at her lips. From the community center, she said simply. Angela murmured her thanks, curiosity sparking as she slid it open. Inside was a letter from Maya, a community organizer whose passion could light up a room. Paired with a stack of photos from a recent workshop, Angela's eyes danced across the imagificers and residents side by side, talking, laughing, breaking bread. In one, Daniel sat cross-legged in a circle, his broad shoulders relaxed, his face unguarded. He was smiling at the sharp, cocky grin she'd once braced against, but something softer, truer. The letter sang of the program's growth, its tendrils reaching further, digging deeper. Thanks in no small part to Daniel's steady presence. Pride flickered in Angela's chest, not just for him, but for the fragile, beautiful thing they were building together. A chance to mend what had been broken, to prove that even the deepest scars could heal. Daniel's road hadn't been smooth. After his badge was stripped away, he'd stumbled hard, floundering in the wreckage of a career that had once defined him. The community center had thrown him a rope, a place to face the mirror and start over. He'd thrown himself into it, volunteering, guiding rookie officers through the muck of their own biases, leading talks that left him raw and exposed. It was grueling, humbling work, the kind that stripped him down to his core. But somewhere in the mess, he found purpose, a sense that he was tethered to something vast and vital. One day, after a session that had wrung him dry, a young recruit approached, their steps halting, voice barely above a whisper. "I just wanted to say thank you," they said, eyes darting to the floor. "Your story, seeing how far you've come, makes me believe I can be better, too." Daniel swallowed hard, the weight of their words catching him off guard. "Thank you," he rasped, "but it's not about me, it's about us. We're in this together." Angela pressed on, her fire unquenched, her name a beacon of grit and grace. To the department, she was a rock. To the community, a pioneer who didn't flinch at the status quo. Invitations piled up, conferences, panels, forums, each one a stage for her to share not her triumphs, but the messy, collective grind of change. She spoke of setbacks as teachers, of progress as a marathon, her voice a steady drumbeat of resolve. One evening, she and Daniel crossed paths at a community gathering, their first real talk in months. The air thrummed with the weight of their shared history. She offered her hand, her smile a quiet flame. "Good to see you, Daniel." He took it, his grip solid, respectful. "You too, Chief," he said, the old title slipping out like a reflex. They lingered, swapping not regrets, but dreams, mapping out the work still looming ahead. As the night faded, Daniel's voice cut through the hum. "You didn't just call me out," he said. "Eyes steady. You showed me I could be more. I won't forget that." His words lodged in her mind, a quiet echo that lingered long after. Years unfurled, and the ripples of their choices spread wide. The precinct morphed into a blueprint for others, a living proof that systems could bend under the right hands. The community center bloomed, its programs threading through lives once thought unreachable. Angela retired, her legacy a lighthouse for those who'd follow. Daniel carved a new path in advocacy, his story has sparked for others to chase reform at its roots. Their journeys split, but their impact wove together a testament to reckoning, to owning the fallout of power misused, and to the slow, stubborn bloom of justice. The city lights still cast long shadows, but now they flickered with possibility, a promise that the fight, however brutal, was worth every step. On a sun-drenched Wednesday afternoon, the air shimmered with the heat of late summer, casting golden hues across the weathered streets of an old neighborhood. Lieutenant Sarah Thompson stepped out of her unmarked police cruiser, the faint hum of the engine fading as she closed the door with a deliberate thud. She adjusted her pristine uniform, the dark fabric hugging her athletic frame, a symbol of the authority she'd earned through years of relentless dedication. The sun gleamed off the badge pinned to her chest, a quiet testament to her journey, a black woman in her late 30s who had climbed the ranks to become one of the most respected figures in her district. Her sharp eyes scanned the surroundings instinctively, a habit born from years of navigating both crime scenes and the subtler dangers of prejudice. There was a quiet power in her stride, a confidence that didn't demand attention but commanded it nonetheless. She'd just left a grueling meeting at City Police headquarters, her mind still buzzing with strategies and reports, when she decided to make a quick detour. The small convenience store on the corner wasn't much to look at. Its faded sign creaked in the breeze, and the windows bore smudges from years of neglect, but it held a strange comfort for her. It was a ritual of sorts, stopping here to exchange a few words with Mr. Singh, the store's elderly Indian clerk. His warm smile and gentle accent had become a grounding force amidst the chaos of her job. As she pushed open the door, the bell above jingled faintly, and the cool air inside brushed against her skin, a brief reprieve from the day's heat. She nodded at Mr. Singh, who stood behind the counter polishing a glass with a rag, his weathered hands moving with the slow rhythm of someone who'd seen decades pass through this little shop. "Good afternoon, Lieutenant Thompson," he said, his voice carrying a warmth that softened the edges of her fatigue. "Always a pleasure to see you." Sarah's lips curved into a small, genuine smile, a rare break in her usual composure. "Hey, Mr. Singh, just grabbing something quick. I've got a long day ahead." She moved toward the cooler, her boots tapping softly against the worn linoleum floor, and plucked a bottle of water and a granola bar from the shelf. Simple choices, practical ones, for a woman who rarely had time to indulge. As she turned toward the counter, a prickling sensation crept up her spine. Simeon was watching her. She glanced over her shoulder and caught sight of a figure in the far corner of the store, a white police officer, younger than her, perhaps in his early 30s, standing rigid with his arms crossed. His cold blue eyes tracked her every move, unblinking, like a predator sizing up its prey. Her brow furrowed slightly. She didn't recognize him, which was unusual. Sarah knew most of the officers in her district by face, if not by name. His uniform was crisp, almost to perfect, and his name badge glinted under the fluorescent lights. Jake Miller. There was something in his stance, stiff, overly confident, that set her on edge. She brushed it off, chalking it up to exhaustion or the oppressive heat outside, and made her way to the counter. Mr. Singh rang up her items, his fingers deft despite their tremble, and handed her the bag with a quiet, "Take care, Lieutenant." She nodded, offering a faint smile, and turned to leave. "Excuse me, miss," a voice cut through the air, sharp and icy, stopping her just as her hand touched the door. "I need to see your ID." Sarah froze, her fingers tightening around the plastic bag. Slowly, she turned to face Officer Miller, who had stepped closer, his hand resting on his holster in a way that felt less like protocol and more like a threat. Up close, she could see the hardness in his expression, the faint smirk tugging at his lips, and the suspicion glinting in his eyes. Her stomach twisted not with fear, but with a familiar, simmering frustration. She'd seen that look before, too many times, the assumption, the unspoken accusation that lingered in the air because of her skin. "Excuse me," she said, her voice steady but edged with steel. She straightened, meeting his gaze head-on. "I don't understand why you're asking for my ID." Miller's smirk widened, though it didn't reach his eyes. He took another step forward, closing the distance until only a few feet separated them. "I saw you acting suspiciously in the store," he said, his tone dripping with authority he hadn't earned. "I need to check your ID. Now." Sarah's heart thudded against her ribs, not out of nervousness but from the slow burn of anger igniting within her. Suspiciously, she'd walked in, picked up two items, and paid for them, hardly the behavior of a thief. She glanced at Mr. Singh, who had paused mid-motion behind the counter, his rag still in hand, his dark eyes darting between her and Miller with growing unease. The store felt smaller now, the air thicker, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. "I'm Lieutenant Sarah Thompson, City Police Department," she said, her words deliberate, each one carrying the weight of her rank. "If you're implying something, you'll need to explain yourself, and you'll need a damn good reason to demand my ID." Miller's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening as if her response had struck a nerve. "Lieutenant, huh?" he scoffed, his disbelief plain. "I saw you handling merchandise, looking like you were about to slip something under your jacket. Show me your ID, or we've got a problem." The accusation hit her like a slap, sharp and stinging. Her mind raced, piecing together the absurdity of it. A decorated officer, accused of stealing a granola bar in a store she'd visited dozens of times. She felt the heat rising in her chest, her fists clenching at her sides. But she forced herself to stay calm. Years of facing down prejudice had taught her that losing control only fed into their narrative. She took a deep breath, her gaze locking onto his with an intensity that made him shift slightly. "You're accusing me of stealing?" she asked, her voice low but cutting. "I bought a bottle of water and a granola bar, paid for them right there in front of Mr. Singh. If you've got evidence, let's hear it. Otherwise, you're wasting my time and yours." Miller didn't flinch, but his eyes grew colder, his hand twitching toward his handcuffs. "I've seen enough," he snapped. "This is your last chance before I arrest you." Arrest her, the word echoed in her mind, absurd and infuriating. She stepped forward, closing the gap between them, her presence towering despite their similar height. "I'm Lieutenant Sarah Thompson," she repeated, her voice rising just enough to carry through the store. "And unless you've got a legal basis for this, you're about to make a very big mistake." For a moment, they stood locked in a silent standoff, the tension crackling like static. Miller's face twisted with something dark, anger, maybe, or wounded pride. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone like her. His hand tightened on his holster, a subtle flex of power, and then, with a sneer, he reached for his cuffs. "Fine," he said, his voice thick with venom. "We'll sort this out at the station. Turn around." Before she could protest, he grabbed her arm, twisting it behind her back with a roughness that made her wince. The cold metal of the handcuffs snapped around her wrists, biting into her skin, and a gasp escaped Mr. Singh, who dropped his rag and started forward as if to intervene. "Officer, please," he began, his voice trembling, but Miller shot him a glare that silenced him. Sarah's mind spun as he marched her out of the store, the bell jangling mockingly behind them. The sun hit her face like a spotlight as he paraded her through the parking lot, her uniform now a humiliating prop in this twisted display. A small crowd had gathered, shoppers, passersby, a teenage boy on a bike heel staring, whispering, their eyes wide with shock or curiosity. She kept her head high, her jaw clenched, refusing to let the shame take root. Inside, though, she was a storm of emotions, fury at Miller's arrogance, sorrow at the familiarity of this indignity, and a quiet resolve to see this through. Back at the station, the air was thick with the hum of fluorescent lights and the murmur of officers at their desks. Miller shoved her toward the booking area, his grip tight on her arm, oblivious to the stares they were drawing. Sarah's sharp eyes caught the shift in the room, the way heads turned, the way conversations faltered. Then a voice cut through the noise, deep and authoritative. "What the hell is going on here?" Captain Reynolds, a grizzled veteran with graying hair and a no-nonsense demeanor, stepped forward, his brows furrowing as he took in the scene. His gaze landed on Sarah, then flicked to Miller, who suddenly seemed smaller under the weight of that scrutiny. "Captain," Miller said, straightening up, though his voice wavered slightly. "Caught this woman shoplifting. She resisted, so I—" "Shoplifting," Reynolds interrupted, his tone incredulous. He looked at Sarah again, recognition dawning in his eyes. "Lieutenant Thompson." The room went silent, the air sucked out of it in an instant. Miller's face drained of color, his bravado crumbling as the reality sank in. Sarah stood tall, the cuffs still biting into her wrists, her expression unreadable but her eyes blazing with a quiet fury. She didn't need to say a word. Her presence, her rank, her dignity spoke volumes. Reynolds turned on Miller, his voice a low growl. "You just arrested one of the best officers in this department over what? A bottle of water. Uncuff her, now." Miller fumbled with the keys, his hands trembling as he released her. The cuffs fell away, and Sarah rubbed her wrists, her gaze never leaving him. She could see it in his face, the dawning horror, the realization that he'd not only misjudged her, but humiliated himself. In front of the entire station, the other officers watched in stunned silence, some exchanging glances, others staring at Miller with thinly veiled disgust. For Sarah, this wasn't just about the moment, it was about every time she'd been doubted, every glance that lingered too long, every whispered assumption she'd had to disprove. It was about the system that let someone like Miller wield power without accountability, and the slow, painful work of dismantling it. She thought of Mr. Singh, his worried face as she was dragged away, and the community she served, who deserved better than this. As Miller stammered an apology, his voice barely audible, Sarah cut him off with a raised hand. "Save it," she said, her tone icy but calm. "This isn't about your regret, it's about what you learn from it. Justice isn't punishment. Officer Miller, it's growth. Start there." She turned to Reynolds, who gave her a nod of respect tinged with apology, and walked away, her boots echoing in the silence. Behind her, Miller stood alone, the weight of his actions pressing down on him like a physical force. For Sarah, this was another battle won, but the war won for equity, for redemption, for a system that didn't break people before it healed them was far from over. And in that truth lay the deepest lesson of all. Power unchecked breeds chaos, but accountability, rooted in humility, paves the way for progress. The command rang out like a gunshot in the stillness of the store. "Put your hands behind your back. You're under arrest for suspicion of shoplifting." Sarah stood rooted to the spot, her breath catching in her chest as if the world had screeched to a halt. The words echoed in her ears, each syllable a hammer striking at her sense of reality. Arrested for shoplifting? The accusation wasn't just a slap in the face, it was a grotesque misuse of authority, a jagged wound tearing through the fabric of everything she believed in. Her mind reeled, grappling with the absurdity of it all. She, a black woman who had clawed her way up to the rank of lieutenant in the city police department, now stood accused of a petty crime she hadn't even dreamed of committing. The weight of it pressed down on her, a suffocating mix of disbelief and fury. Officer Jake Miller loomed before her, his eyes glinting with a venomous arrogance that made her stomach churn. His gaze wasn't just cold, it was triumphant, as if he'd been waiting for this moment to pounce. Around them, the store buzzed with the curious stares of other shoppers, their whispers cutting through the tense silence like tiny knives. Sarah could feel their eyes boring into her, each glance a thread in the tapestry of her growing humiliation. The fluorescent lights overhead seemed harsher now, casting long shadows that stretched across the tiled floor, amplifying the surreal nightmare unfolding before her. Despite the rage simmering in her vine-shot and unrelenting, she forced herself to take a deep, steadying breath. This wasn't the time to let emotion rule. She knew Miller's type, a man intoxicated by his own power, itching for any excuse to escalate things. One wrong move, and this could spiral into something far uglier, far more dangerous. For her own safety, for the sake of keeping this from turning violent, she had to play it smart. With deliberate slowness, Sarah turned, her movements measured as she raised her hands and placed them behind her head. Just as Miller had barked, the air grew thicker, the silence in the store more oppressive, broken only by the sharp, metallic click of the handcuffs snapping shut around her wrists. The cold steel bit into her skin, a sensation she'd administered countless times in her years as an officer, but never once imagined feeling herself. A wave of humiliation crashed over her, drowning out the anger for a fleeting moment. She wasn't just Sarah anymore, not the proud lieutenant who'd spent years safeguarding this community. In that instant, she was a suspect, a criminal in the eyes of everyone watching. The cuffs tightened further as Miller adjusted them, and she winced inwardly, though she refused to let it show. Her career had been built on resilience, on facing down chaos with unflinching resolve. But this was a betrayal of everything she'd worked for. Miller's grip clamped down on her arm, firm and unyielding, as he shoved her toward the store's front door. The physical sting of the cuffs paled in comparison to the searing shame that burned through her. Each step felt like a march through quicksand, the weight of the onlookers' stares dragging her deeper into a mire of disgrace. She caught snippets of their murmurs. Is that a cop? What's happening? Their voices a chorus of confusion and intrigue. Outside, the harsh midday sun assaulted her senses, its glare bouncing off the pavement and intensifying the pressure bearing down on her. Pedestrians halted in their tracks, some fumbling for their phones to capture the spectacle. A police officer in uniform, handcuffed and escorted like a common thief. Sarah's heart thudded against her ribcage, a frantic rhythm that matched the chaos swirling in her mind. She wanted to scream, to demand they stop gawking, but she clenched her jaw instead. Lifting her chin defiantly, she wouldn't let them, especially Miller, see her break. "You're making a huge mistake, Officer Miller," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor threatening to crack it. "I'm not someone you can trample over with your badge. I'm Lieutenant Sarah Thompson of the City Police Department. I didn't steal anything." Her words hung in the air, sharp and deliberate, a lifeline thrown into the storm of injustice engulfing her. But Miller didn't flinch, his lips curled into a smirk, a smug, self-satisfied twist that revealed the truth. This wasn't about evidence or justice. It was a game to him, a chance to flex his authority and revel in her downfall. "You can say whatever you want," he replied, his tone dripping with glee. "I saw how you acted in there. Now you're coming with me to the station, and the law will sort you out." The way he said law made her skin crawl. It wasn't a shield to him, but a weapon, wielded with reckless abandon against someone he clearly despised. That someone just happened to be her, a black woman in a uniform he refused to respect. As they approached the patrol car parked haphazardly by the curb, Miller yanked open the back door with a flourish, his movements brimming with theatrical cruelty. Without a word, he pushed her inside, the force enough to make her stumble before she caught herself on the edge of the seat. The door slammed shut behind her with a resounding thud, locking her into a space that felt more like a cage than a vehicle. Inside, the air was stifling, thick with the heat of the sun streaming through the windows. Sweat beaded on her forehead, but it was the weight of her situation that pressed down hardest. She'd sat in the front of these cars countless times, barking orders, making decisions, upholding the law. Now, she was relegated to the back, a prisoner in a world she'd once commanded. Through the glass, she watched Miller saunter to the driver's side, radio in hand, his posture radiating arrogance. "This is Officer Jake Miller, badge number 4396, he announced into the crackling device, his voice loud enough for her to hear every word. "I've just arrested a suspect male, black, mid-30s. Name's Lieutenant Sarah Thompson of the City Police Department. Reason, suspected shoplifting." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. Her name, her rank, her identity reduced to a cold, clinical report broadcast over the radio waves for all to hear. Her career, the years of late nights and hard-fought battles, the trust she'd earned from her community was all unraveling with each syllable Miller spat out. She stared out the window as the car pulled away, the familiar streets of her city blurring past. These were the roads she'd patrolled, the corners where she'd mediated disputes, the intersections where she'd stood as a beacon of order. Now, they mocked her, their familiarity twisted into a cruel reminder of how far she'd fallen. The patrol car rolled into the station's parking lot, and her pulse quickened, a frantic drumbeat echoing her dread, she'd walked through those doors 1,000 times confident, respected, in control. Today, she'd enter as a spectacle, a disgraced figure paraded before her peers. Miller didn't bother with gentleness as he opened the door and hauled her out, his grip rough enough to throw her off balance. She stumbled, her boots scuffing the asphalt, but she straightened quickly, refusing to let him see her falter. The station loomed ahead, its gray facade as imposing as ever, yet it felt alien now, a place stripped of the comfort it once held. Inside, the air shifted thicker. Javier's every officer and staff member froze, their eyes locking onto her. The hum of conversation died, replaced by a stunned silence that rang in her ears. Some stared with wide-eyed disbelief, others with furrowed brows of suspicion. A young officer near the coffee machine muttered, "Lieutenant Thompson, what's going on here?" His voice trembled with confusion, mirroring the chaos in Sarah's own mind. She wanted to answer, to explain, but Miller's hand on her arm propelled her forward, cutting off any chance to speak. He marched her straight to Officer Reynolds' desk, the man in charge of processing suspects. Miller slammed a stack of papers down with a flourish, his attitude icy and detached. "Got a suspect to process," he declared. "Suspected shoplifting." Reynolds looked up, his weathered face creasing with shock as recognition dawned. "Lieutenant Thompson," he asked, his voice a mix of disbelief and concern. "What's going on?" "You were arrested for shoplifting." Sarah met his gaze, her chest tightening. She could see the truth reflected in his eyes. She knew this was wrong, but the scene unfolding before him carried a weight that overshadowed reason. To her colleagues, the image of her in handcuffs was a stain, a crack in the foundation of her authority. She stood there, surrounded by the familiar buzz of the station's clatter of keyboards, the flicker of fluorescent lights, but it all felt distant, as if she were a ghost haunting a life she no longer belonged to. In that moment, Sarah's resolve hardened. This wasn't just about clearing her name. It was about reclaiming the honor she'd spent years building. Miller's abuse of power wasn't a solitary act, it was a lesson, a glaring warning of what happened when justice was twisted into a tool for petty vengeance. She wouldn't let it define her. As the whispers of her colleagues swirled around her, as the weight of their judgment pressed down, she held her head high. The truth would come out, she told herself. It had to, because if it didn't, the lesson wouldn't just be hers, it would be a scar on the very system she'd sworn to uphold. The air in the police station hung heavy with tension, thick enough to choke on. As Officer Reynolds stood behind the desk, his hands trembling slightly despite his best efforts to steady them, the sight of Sarah Thompson, his colleague, his friend, a woman whose dedication to the badge had inspired him for years, being dragged in under such absurd circumstances had left him reeling. His heart thudded painfully in his chest, a dull ache spreading as he processed the scene before him. Sarah, with her sharp eyes and unyielding resolve, accused of something as petty as shoplifting? The very idea clashed violently with everything he knew about her. She was a pillar of integrity, a lieutenant who had earned her stripes through grit and honor. Yet here she was, standing before him, her wrists bound by cold steel, her face a mask of quiet fury and wounded pride. Reynolds felt the weight of his duty pressing down on him. Like a lead blanket posture demanded he act, but his gut screamed that this was wrong. Terribly wrong. "Is this for real, Lieutenant?" His voice came out low, laced with worry. Almost a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile hope that this was all a mistake. He leaned forward slightly, searching Sarah's face for answers, his brows furrowed in confusion and concern. He'd seen her face down hardened criminals without flinching, but now she stood cornered, accused by one of their own. "Can you explain what's going on here?" he pressed, his tone pleading for clarity, for something to make sense of this nightmare. Sarah met his gaze, her hazel eyes blazing with a fire that refused to be extinguished, though her voice remained steady, a testament to her iron will. "I didn't steal anything, Reynolds," she said, each word deliberate, cutting through the stifling air. "This is a setupa, blatant abuse of power by Officer Miller. He's got it out for me, and this is his twisted way of proving a point." Her lips pressed into a thin line, and beneath her calm exterior, a storm of emotions churned: danger, betrayal, and a deep, gnawing shame at being treated like a common thief in the very station where she'd built her legacy. Reynolds' head swiveled toward Officer Miller, who lingered a few steps behind Sarah, his broad frame filling the space with an air of smug authority. Miller's arms were crossed tightly over his chest. His lips curled into a smirk that oozed satisfaction, as though he'd just won some grand victory. His dark eyes glinted with malice, and when he spoke, his voice was icy, dripping with disdain. "I caught her red-handed," he said, his words clipped and confident, leaving no room for doubt, at least in his own mind. She was about to walk out of that convenience store with unpaid merchandise. "I saw her suspicious behavior myself, shifty, nervous, the whole act." He shrugged nonchalantly, as if accusing a fellow officer of theft was just another day's work. Reynolds shook his head, disbelief etching deeper lines into his weathered face. He'd known Sarah for over a decade, long enough to recognize her character, her unwavering moral compass. This wasn't her, it couldn't be. But the system didn't care about his instincts or their shared history. It demanded he follow the rules, no matter how unjust they felt in this moment. With a heavy sigh that seemed to drag his shoulders down further, he reached for the stack of papers Miller had carelessly tossed onto the desk. "All right," he muttered, his voice thick with reluctance. "We'll have to go through the procedure. I'll need to fingerprint you and take your picture, Lieutenant." He paused, meeting Sarah's eyes again, his own filled with quiet apology. "I really don't want to do this, but you know how it works. We've got no choice." Sarah gave a curt nod, her silence speaking volumes. She understood Reynolds wasn't the enemy, her was just a cog in the machine, bound by the same rigid protocols she'd once enforced herself. But that didn't lessen the sting, the crushing humiliation of being processed like a criminal in a place she'd called home. As Reynolds pulled out the fingerprinting kit, his movements slow and deliberate, Sarah felt a lump rise in her throat. She swallowed hard, closing her eyes for a fleeting moment as her fingers brushed against the cold, slick ink. One by one, her fingertips pressed into the stark white paper, leaving behind a trail of black marks she'd once used to hunt down the guilty, now branding her as one of them. Each press of her finger felt like a betrayal, a twisting knife in the gut, stripping away the pride she'd carried for so long. Miller watched it all unfold, his stance unwavering, arms still crossed like a king surveying his domain. The smug grin never left his face, and with every step of the process, his ego seemed to swell. This wasn't just about procedure for him, it was a performance, a flex of power designed to break Sarah down and elevate himself in the eyes of anyone watching. He thrived on her discomfort, relishing the way the station's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows over her strained expression. To him, this was justice, a petty revenge cloaked as duty. But Sarah refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. Beneath the anger and hurt, a steely resolve took root. She wouldn't let this define her. This was a battle for more than just her innocence. It was a fight to reclaim her dignity from a man who wielded authority like a blunt weapon. When the fingerprinting was done, Reynolds gestured toward the white wall where a camera waited, its lens a cold, unblinking eye. "We need to take your picture now, Lieutenant," he said softly, almost as if he were asking forgiveness. Sarah took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders as she stepped forward. She stood tall, her chin lifted defiantly, staring straight into the camera's gaze. The flash exploded in a blinding burst, searing the moment into eternity, an image that would forever mark this chapter of her life. To Sarah, it wasn't just a photograph, it was a snapshot of injustice, a permanent reminder of the day her trust in the system she'd served was shattered. As the light faded, she turned to face Miller, who stood there with that same mocking grin plastered across his face. "Think you'll wiggle out of this one easily, Lieutenant?" he taunted, his voice thick with sarcasm, each syllable a jab meant to provoke her. "You made a mistake thinking you're above the law, above me." His eyes gleamed with triumph, certain he'd already won. Sarah locked eyes with him, her anger simmering just beneath the surface. But her voice remained calm, cutting like a blade. "This isn't about the law, Miller. It's about you abusing your power, twisting it into something dirty and personal. But I won't let you win this gamut now, not ever." Her words hung in the air, a quiet promise of resistance. Miller's smirk faltered for a split second, but he quickly recovered, saying nothing more. He didn't need to. His silence screamed confidence, a belief that he held all the cards. With the paperwork complete, Reynolds slipped the handcuffs back onto Sarah's wrists, his hands hesitant as the metal clicked shut. He led her down the station's long, sterile hallway toward the holding cells, each step echoing off the linoleum floor like a drumbeat of defeat. This was a path she'd walked countless times before, but always as the enforcer, the one in control. Now, every clack of her boots felt like a wound to her pride, a reminder of how far she'd fallen in a single day. The officers lining the corridor, some she'd trained, others she'd mentored, watched in stunned silence, their eyes wide with shock or narrowed in suspicion. She kept her head high, refusing to let their stares break her, but the weight of their judgment pressed down all the same. When they reached the holding area, the cold steel door creaked open, revealing a small, dimly lit cell that smelled faintly of disinfectant and despair. Reynolds paused, his gaze soft with sympathy, before stepping aside to let her enter. The door slammed shut behind her with a hollow clang, the sound reverberating in her bonessa final, chilling note of her descent. Alone now, Sarah sank onto the hard bench, her body sagging as the adrenaline drained away. The concrete walls seemed to close in, amplifying the isolation that gnawed at her mind. How had it come to this? A lieutenant with years of service, reduced to a suspect over a fabricated charge? The absurdity of it all twisted her stomach. But beneath the disbelief burned a certainty. This wasn't a mistake. It was deliberate, a product of Miller's racism and unchecked arrogance, a lesson in how power could corrupt even the smallest of men. Yet even in that suffocating cell, Sarah's spirit refused to break. She leaned her head back against the wall, closing her eyes as she steadied her breathing. This was only the beginning. She told herself a skirmish in a war she hadn't asked for, but wouldn't lose. She'd fight back, expose Miller's lies, and prove her innocence, not just for herself but for every officer who'd ever faced such betrayal. The truth would surface, she vowed silently, because just as serial justice couldn't be buried forever. The sharp clang of the cell door jolted her from her thoughts. She looked up to see Captain Rebecca Davis striding in, her presence filling the cramped space with an aura of authority. Davis was a force of nature, stern, unyielding, and fiercely fair. A woman Sarah had admired since her earliest days on the force. Her short-cropped gray hair framed a face set in a hard line, but her dark eyes betrayed a flicker of concern as they settled on Sarah. "What the hell is going on here, Thompson?" Davis demanded, her voice steady but edged with disbelief. "I heard you were arrested for shoplifting off all things. Tell me this isn't what it looks like." Sarah rose to her feet, relief washing over her at the sight of her captain. If anyone could cut through this mess, it was Davis. Still, the humiliation of explaining herself gnawed at her as she spoke. "It's a setup, Captain," she said, her tone firm despite the exhaustion creeping in. "Officer Miller abused his power and slapped me with baseless charges. He claims I stole from a convenience store, says he saw me pocketing something when all I did was buy a bottle of water and a granola bar. This isn't a misunderstanding. It's racism, plain and simple, and a gross misuse of authority." Davis didn't reply immediately. She stood there, arms crossed, studying Sarah with a piercing gaze that seemed to peel back every layer of the story. She was a woman who weighed every word, every action, and Sarah knew she was being measured not as a suspect, but as the officer Davis had always trusted. After a long, tense silence, Davis turned to Reynolds, who hovered awkwardly by the door, clutching his paperwork like a lifeline. "Release her," she ordered, her voice ringing with unshakable command. "Now." Reynolds shifted uncomfortably, his fingers tightening around the papers. "Captain, I get it. But procedure." He stammered, glancing between the two women. "I have to process her according to the rules." "I don't give a damn about procedure right now," Davis snapped, her eyes flashing with a rare intensity. "Release her. If there's fallout, I'll take full responsibility." "That's an order." Her tone left no room for argument, and Reynolds, with a reluctant nod, fumbled with the keys. The cell door swung open, and as he removed the handcuffs, Sarah flexed her wrists, savoring the faint rush of freedom. It wasn't victor in it yet, but it was a start. Davis gave her a sharp nod. "Come with me," she said, turning on her heel and striding out without waiting for a response. Sarah followed, her steps steady despite the whirlwind of emotions still raging inside Harrowleaf. Gratitude and a simmering resolve to see this through. As they passed through the station, the air grew thick with the weight of watching eyes. Her colleagues stood frozen, their expressions a mix of shock, curiosity, and unease. Whispers rippled through the room, too faint to catch but loud enough to feel. Sarah didn't falter. She walked with the same confidence she'd honed over years of service, her head high, her gaze fixed forward. Their doubts couldn't turn it yet. She'd prove them wrong, not with words, but with the truth. In that moment, the lesson crystallized in her mind. Justice wasn't a given, not even within these walls. It could be twisted, manipulated by those like Miller who saw power as a tool for personal gain. But the consequences of such abuse were inevitable. Miller's smug triumph wouldn't last. Sarah would make sure of it. She'd expose him, not out of vengeance, but because the badge they both wore demanded accountability. And as she walked beside Davis, the weight of that responsibility settled over her, heavier than ever, but paired with a fierce determination to see it through to the end. The air inside Captain Davis's office felt heavy, saturated with the weight of countless decisions made within its four walls. The room itself was modest, its tidy shelves and neatly stacked files a testament to the order Davis demanded in her world. A faint scent of old coffee lingered, mingling with the sharp tang of polished wood. Sunlight streamed through a narrow window, casting long shadows across the desk where Davis sat, her posture rigid yet somehow weary. She gestured toward the chair opposite her, her fingers brushing the air with quiet authority. Sarah hesitated for a split second before settling into the seat, the worn leather creaking beneath her. Her heart thudded in her chest, not from fear, but from the simmering resolve that had been building inside her for days. "Sarah," Davis began, her voice softer than usual, though it carried an unmistakable edge of gravity. "I've known you for years. You're not just a good official, you're one of the best I've ever worked with. Your dedication, your integrity, it's never been in question. Not with me." She paused, her dark eyes searching Sarah's face, as if measuring the toll this ordeal had already taken. "But something about this case stinks. Officer Miller, he's crossed lines before. I've heard whispers, seen patterns. This isn't new behavior for him. What we need is hard proof. Without it, we're just chasing shadows." Sarah nodded, her jaw tightening as Davis's words sank in. She'd known the captain was sharp, fair, and fiercely committed to the truth, but hearing it aloud steadied her. What had happened wasn't a petty misunderstanding or a fleeting clash of egos. It was a calculated strike, a venomous attempt to shred her reputation and everything she'd built. Her mind flashed back to the convenience store, the accusing glares, the cold grip of handcuffs she didn't deserve. "I know you're right, Captain," she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "It's not just about power with Miller. He wants to bury me. But the security footage from that story, if we can get the original, untainted version, I'm certain it'll show what really happened. It'll prove I didn't do this." Davis leaned back in her chair, her fingers drumming lightly on the desk as she weighed Sarah's words. The faint hum of the station filtered through the waltz phones ringing, voices murmuring, the steady pulse of a place that never truly slept. After a moment, she nodded. "I'll handle it myself," she said decisively. "I'll request the footage from the store and start an investigation into Miller's actions." But Sarah, her tone sharpened, a warning laced with concern. "You need to brace yourself. Miller's not some reckless rookie. If he's behind this, he's covered his tracks, he's cunning, and he won't go down without a fight. This could get messy." Sarah exhaled, the breath escaping her lips in a slow, deliberate stream. She knew Davis wasn't exaggerating. She'd seen it too many times, officers drunk on their own authority, bending rules, breaking lives, all to shield their egos or hide their sins. Miller wasn't just a bully, he was a predator, and she'd become his prey. "I'm not backing down." "Captain," she said, her voice rising with a fierce clarity, "I've poured my life into this Jobinto justice, into doing what's right. I won't let him take that from me, not without a fight." Davis's gaze softened, a flicker of empathy breaking through her stern exterior. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the desk. "I believe in you, Sarah, I do. But this isn't just about clearing your name. It's bigger than that. It's about the system we're part of, fairness we're supposed to uphold. If Miller's abusing his power, it's a crack in everything we stand for. We have to do this right, or it all falls apart. For the first time in days, Sarah felt a wave of relief crash over her. Cool and soothing against the heat of her anger, she wasn't alone. Davis, with her unshakable sense of duty, was in her corner. Together, they could dig through the lies and unearth the truth. But beneath that relief, a knot of dread tightened in her stomach. Miller was a coiled snake, dangerous, unpredictable, and ready to strike again. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As she rose from the chair, her resolve hardened like steel. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. Ash was fighting for every soul who'd ever been crushed under the weight of unchecked power. Justice wasn't a word to her. It was a vow. Stepping out of the office, the station's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glow on the tiled floor. Sarah's boots clicked against it as she pulled out her phone, her fingers trembling slightly not from fear, but from the urgency pulsing through her veins. She dialed Jason Walker, her partner of nearly a decade, a man whose loyalty was as steady as the sunrise. The line crackled. Then his familiar voice broke through, laced with worry. "Sarah, what's going on? You sound off." "Jason, I need you," she said, skipping pleasantries. Her words spilled out in a rush, calm but insistent. "I've been set up, arrested for a theft I didn't commit. Miller's behind it has pinned me for stealing from the convenience store. I know the security footage will show the truth, but I need help getting it. He's trying to ruin me." A stunned silence stretched across the line. Sarah could picture Jason, his brow furrowing, his broad shoulders tensing as he processed her words. "Are you kidding me?" he finally said, his voice thick with disbelief. "Miller, that sleaze? I've heard the rumor guy's always had a chip on his shoulder, throwing his weight around like he owns the place. But this, targeting you, that's insane. He's gone way over the line." "Exactly," Sarah replied, her tone hardening. "He's not just flexing, trying to erase me. But I'm not letting him win. We need that footage, Jason, the original, before he gets his hands on it. It's my only shot." Jason let out a low whistle, the sound crackling through the phone. "All right, I'm in. I'll dig into who reported the theft, see if I can track down that footage. If Miller's tampered with anything or paid someone off, we'll sniff it out. This is personal now." His confidence steadied her, a lifeline in the chaos. "Thanks, Jason," she said, her voice softening with gratitude. "I don't know what I'd do without you." "Don't mention it," he shot back, a hint of warmth cutting through his gruff tone. "We'll figure this out. I'll call you the second I've got something." The line went dead, and Sarah slipped the phone into her pocket, her mind racing. Miller hadn't acted on impulse, had planned this, every step meticulously laid out to trap her. If she didn't move fast, he'd bury the evidence, and her career along with it. As she stood there, a sudden thought jolted her. The convenience store's camera were her lifeline. But if Miller had altered the footage, someone had to know. Her memory snagged on the store clerk, Mr. Patel, a weary man with darting eyes and a nervous habit of wiping his hands on his apron. That day, when Miller stormed in with his accusations, Patel had seemed off, fidgety, scared. Had he been pressured, paid, whatever it was, he held a piece of this puzzle. She needed to talk to him. No. The next morning, the convenience store loomed ahead, its faded sign flickering in the pale dawn light. Sarah and Jason pushed through the glass door, the bell jangling sharply above them. The place smelled of stale cigarettes and cheap air freshener, its shelves cluttered with candy bars and dusty cans. To Sarah, it wasn't just a store anymore, it was a battlefield, the site of her humiliation. Her stomach churned as memories flooded back, Miller's smug grin, the cold metal biting her wrists, the sting of betrayal from a system she'd sworn to protect. Behind the counter, Mr. Patel froze, his hands pausing mid-motion as he straightened a stack of lottery tickets. His thin face paled, his eyes darting between Sarah and Jason like a cornered animal. Hello," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mr. Patel," Sarah said, keeping her tone even but firm. "We need to talk about what happened the other day." She stepped closer, her gaze locking onto his. Up close, she could see the sweat beading on his forehead, the way his fingers twitched against the counter. "To told the police everything," he said, his words tumbling out too fast. "I don't know anything else. I was just following orders." Sarah's eyes narrowed. "I don't buy that, Mr. Patel. Something's not right here. And I think you know it. This is your chance to come clean before this blows up in your face." Patel's shoulders slumped, his resolve crumbling under her stare. "I didn't want to," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Miller came here days ago. Told me to report a theft. Said I'd regret it if I didn't. I've got a family." Bilsey couldn't say no. His hands shook as he spoke, guilt and fear warring in his eyes. Sarah's blood boiled, but she kept her composure, her face a mask of calm. Miller hadn't just framed her, bullied an innocent man into his scheme, wielding his badge like a weapon. "We need your help, Mr. Patel," Jason cut in, his voice low and commanding. "Give us an official statement about Miller's threats. Do that, and we'll make sure you're protected." Patel nodded, tears welling in his eyes. "Okay, I'll do it. I just want this over." As they left the store, Sarah felt a flicker of hope ignite within her. Patel's testimony was a crack in Miller's armor, but it wasn't enough. They still needed that footage. Back at the station, her phone buzzed with a message from Davis. "Footage retrieved. Meet me now." Her pulse quickened. This could be if key to her freedom. But doubt gnawed at her. Miller was too clever to leave loose ends. Whatever came next, she'd face it head on, armed with the truth and the unshakable will to see justice done. In the dimly lit office of Captain Davis, a palpable tension hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. The captain sat behind her desk, her posture rigid, her face a mask of composure that barely concealed the storm brewing beneath. Her eyes, however, gleamed with a sharpness that could cut through steel, betraying the gravity of the moment. On the desk before her rested a laptop, its sleek surface reflecting the faint glow of the overhead light. Sarah Thompson, a lieutenant with a career now teetering on the edge of ruin, felt her chest tighten as her gaze locked onto the device. She knew it held the security footage, her lifeline, her only hope of proving her innocence. "Take a seat, Sarah," Captain Davis said, her voice steady but laced with an undercurrent of urgency. She gestured toward the two chairs across from her, inviting Sarah and her partner, Jason, to settle in. Jason, ever the professional, adjusted his tie and sat with a calm that Sarah envied. His face remained impassive, but she caught the subtle clench of his jaw, a telltale sign of the tension he hid so well. For Sarah, though, sitting was an act of sheer willpower. Her breath came in short, shallow bursts, her nerves fraying as the reality of the situation sank in deeper with every passing second. Captain Davis leaned forward slightly, her hands clasped on the desk, and took a slow, deliberate breath. When she spoke again, her tone softened, her eyes flickering with something close to empathy as they met Sarah's. "I've gone over the footage," she began, her words heavy with meaning. "But we've got a serious issue on our hands. The most critical part that matters most has been altered. Someone's tampered with it." Sarah's heart lurched violently in her chest, as if it might break free and shatter on the floor. "Tampered with?" she echoed, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to steady it. "How could that even happen? That footage—it's everything. It's the only thing that can clear my name." Her mind raced, spiraling into a whirlpool of disbelief and dread. She'd staked her entire defense on that recording, and now it was slipping through her fingers like sand. Davis nodded, her lips pressing into a thin line. Frustration flickered in her eyes, mirroring Sarah's own turmoil. "I know," she said, her voice firm yet tinged with a quiet resolve. "That's exactly why we can't waste any time. I've got a strong suspicion Miller's behind this. The footage shows you in the store, Sarah, clear as day. But the part where you're accused of stealing, it's gone cut out like it never existed. We need to track down the original, unedited version before he gets rid of it for good." Jason, who had been sitting silently, his hands folded in his lap, finally broke his stillness. He leaned forward, his voice tight with barely restrained anger. "So you're saying Miller's still got the real footage somewhere? If we don't move now, he'll have all the time he needs to wipe it clean and bury us." His words hung in the air, sharp and cutting, a stark reminder of the stakes they faced. Sarah's anger surged, hot and fierce, coursing through her veins like wildfire. Miller, her supposed colleague, A man she'd once trusted had orchestrated this nightmare. He was trying to dismantle her career, shred her honor, and leave her with nothing. And now, it seemed, he was on the verge of succeeding. "We can't let that happen," she said, her voice rising with a newfound determination that surprised even her. "We've got to find that evidence before it's gone forever. He can't just walk away from this." Captain Davis gave a curt nod, her expression hardening with resolve. "I've already set things in motion, an official investigation into Miller's actions. But we're on a tight clock here. Jason, Sarah, you'd need to figure out where he stashed that original footage. If we can get our hands on it, this whole mess ends and justice gets its due." Just as the trio began to hash out their next steps, the office door burst open with a force that rattled the walls. Miller stormed in, his presence a thunderclap in the quiet room. His face was a mask of fury, his eyes blazing with a mix of resentment and defiance. He strode forward, ignoring Jason and Sarah entirely, his focus locked on Captain Davis. "What the hell is this?" he bellowed, his voice dripping with venom. "Why am I hearing whispers that you're digging into me? This is outrageous." Captain Davis rose to her feet, her movements slow and deliberate, exuding an unshakable calm that stood in stark contrast to Miller's rage. "We're looking into your conduct, Miller," she said evenly, her gaze unflinching. "There's evidence suggesting you've been abusing your authority, tampering with footage in Lieutenant Thompson's case. To be precise, this isn't a game." Miller let out a harsh, mocking laugh, his smug grin twisting his features into something ugly. "You've got to be kidding me. Thompson was caught red-handed, snatching goods like some petty thief. And now you're flipping the script to come after me. What do you think you're playing at?" Sarah couldn't hold back any longer. She shot to her feet, her fear evaporating in the heat of her outrage. She stepped toward Miller, locking eyes with him, her voice steady and fierce. "You set me up, Miller. You forced Mr. Paddle to lie, to file that fake report. And then you doctored the footage to bury the truth. You're trying to destroy me, but I'm not going down without a fight. You won't get away with this." Miller took a menacing step closer, his face contorted with defiance, his breath hot with anger. "You think you can take me down, Thompson? You've got nothing, no proof, no leverage. Your career's already toast. Give it up." Jason surged to his feet beside Sarah, his patience snapping like a taut wire. "We'll find the evidence, Miller," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "That footage you messed with, it's not going to stay hidden forever. If you think you can slink away unscathed, you're dead wrong." Miller's eyes narrowed, his expression darkening into something almost predatory. "You're out of your depth," he snarled. "I've been around long enough to know how to tie up loose ends. You're all bluffing, and it's pathetic." Captain Davis cut through the escalating tension, her voice a blade of authority. "Enough, Miller. I've launched a full investigation into your actions. If you've got anything to say, you'd better prepare to face the consequences. I won't let anyone, especially you, taint this system with corruption." Miller huffed, his chest heaving with barely contained rage. He took a step back, his glare sweeping over them all. "You'll regret this," he spat, his words dripping with malice. Then, with a final sneer, he turned on his heel and stormed out, slamming the door so hard the frame shuddered. The room fell silent, the air thick with the aftermath of his departure. Sarah's heart pounded wildly, a chaotic rhythm of fear and resolve. She knew this was far from over. Jason turned to her, his eyes burning with determination. "We've got to find that original footage," he said, his voice urgent. "If we don't, Miller's going to twist this whole thing against us." Captain Davis nodded, her expression grim but resolute. "He's probably already moved Ethidnet somewhere he thinks we'll never look. We need to figure out his next move and beat him to it." Sarah's mind raced, sifting through memories of past cases, searching for a clue. Then it hit her a spark of insight that felt like a lifeline. If Miller's trying to keep that footage safe, he wouldn't leave it somewhere obvious. He'd stash it where he has total control. What about his house in the suburbs? It's isolated, privately perfect for hiding something like this. Jason's brow furrowed as he considered it, his fingers tapping restlessly against his thigh. "That makes sense. He's got that place out there, 2 stories. Plenty of room to tuck something away. Could be our best shot." Davis paused, weighing the idea, then gave a decisive nod. "All right, We'll check his house. But we've got to move fast. Miller's not going to sit idle while we close in. If we don't act soon, that evidence is gone." In a matter of moments, a plan took shape. Jason and Sarah would head to Miller's house, risking everything to recover the footage, while Captain Davis stayed behind to run interference and keep Miller off their trail. The weight of the mission settled over them like a lead cloak. They all knew this was their final chance to unearth the truth and bring Miller's corruption crashing down. Failure wasn't an option for Sarah, whose honor hung in the balance, and not for the team, who refused to let justice slip away. As Sarah and Jason left the station, the night air hit them with a chill that matched the uncertainty gnawing at their insides. They climbed into their unmarked car, the engine rumbling to life as they set off toward Miller's suburban hideaway. Sarah stared out the window, watching the city lights blur into streaks of color. Every second felt like a countdown, each tick of the clock tightening the noose around her future. If they didn't find that footage, Miller's lies would cement her ruin, and he'd walk free to prey on others unchecked. The thought fueled her resolve, hardening it into something unbreakable. The drive was tense, the silence between them heavy with unspoken fears. As they neared Miller's house, a modern two-story structure nestled in the quiet suburbs, the darkness seemed to deepen, cloaking their approach. The house stood alone, its clean lines and manicured lawn giving no hint of the conspiracy festering within. Yet Sarah could feel the weight of secrets lurking behind its serene facade. "We're doing this," she said, her voice firm as they parked a safe distance away and stepped into the shadows. "This is the final battle." Jason met her gaze, his nod a silent vow of solidarity. Together, they moved toward the house, their footsteps muffled by the gathering dusk. The backyard offered their best entry point. No cameras, Jason had confirmed earlier. They crept along the perimeter, the grass damp beneath their boots, the air thick with the scent of earth and impending rain. Sarah's hand brushed the gun at her hip, its cold metal grounding her racing thoughts. Jason knelt by the rear door, his toolkit glinting faintly as he worked the lock with practiced precision. Sarah kept watch, her eyes darting across the yard, every rustle of leaves amplifying her nerves. The lock clicked softly, a sound that echoed like a gunshot in the stillness, and they slipped inside. The house was a tomb of silence, every creak of the floorboards a potential betrayal. Sarah's pulse thundered in her ears as they navigated the darkened halls. Their destination clear, Miller's private office on the second floor. The room, tucked at the end of a long hallway, overlooked the backyard through a wide window framed by heavy curtains. Jason signaled for her to wait, his silhouette vanishing briefly as he checked for any signs of life. "Clear," he whispered, and they stepped inside. The office was chaos, papers strewn across the desk, files spilling from shelves, a testament to Miller's arrogance or paranoia. Sarah's hope flared. The disorder suggested they were close. Jason rifled through drawers, his movements swift and silent, while Sarah scoured the desk, her fingers trembling as she sifted through the clutter. Then, a triumphant hiss from Jason got it. He held up a small, unmarked USB drive, its simplicity belying its importance. Sarah's breath caught. This was it, the key to her salvation. But their victory was short-lived. A loud crash erupted from the front of the house, shattering the silence. Sarah's heart leapt into her throat as heavy footsteps pounded through the hall. Miller, home too soon, his anger a tangible force reverberating through the walls. "Hurry," she whispered, her voice sharp with panic. Jason shoved the USB into his pocket, and they bolted for cover, the truth now within reach, but the danger closer than ever. The battle for justice had just begun, and the consequences of Miller's abuse of power loomed larger with every step he took toward them. In the dim, suffocating stillness of the office, Sarah wedged herself into the shadowed corner, her body pressed so tightly against the wall that she could feel the rough texture of the paint scraping her skin. Her breaths came in short, ragged gasps, each one a desperate attempt to stay silent, to keep the pounding of her heart from betraying her. Her fingers curled around the cold metal of her gun, the weight of it grounding her as her mind raced with a storm of fear and resolve. She wasn't just hiding from danger, she was hiding from a man who had twisted the system she'd sworn to protect into a weapon of his own corruption. The air was thick with tension, heavy with the scent of old coffee and stale paper. When the door exploded inward with a deafening crash, Miller stormed into the room, his broad frame filling the doorway, his gun already drawn and gleaming under the flickering fluorescent light. His face was a mask of unrestrained fury, eyes wild and bloodshot. His jaw clenched so tight it seemed his teeth might shatter. Papers were strewn across the floor, drawers yanked open. A chair toppled his once pristine office, now a chaotic testament to his unraveling control. "Come out now," he bellowed, his voice a raw, guttural roar that echoed off the walls. Dripping with anger and a madness that sent a chill down Sarah's spine. "I know you're in here." Sarah's chest tightened. This was the moment she'd known would come. The confrontation she'd steeled herself for through sleepless nights and whispered plans. Her eyes flicked to Jason, crouched behind a filing cabinet across the room, his own gun clutched in steady hands. Their gazes locked for a fleeting second, a silent exchange of trust and determination passing between them like a lifeline. With a barely perceptible nod, they moved as one, rising from their hiding places with the precision of soldiers stepping into battle. Guns leveled, barrels trained on Miller, they faced him head-on. "Freeze, Miller, drop the gun-o." Sarah's voice cut through the air, sharp as a blade, unwavering despite the tremor she felt deep in her core. She stood tall, her stance firm, her dark hair falling in loose strands across her sweat-dampened forehead, every ounce of her being radiating command. Miller whirled toward her, his eyes blazing with a feral intensity that made her stomach twist. "You think you can take me down?" He spat, his words venomous, his lips curling into a sneer. "You think you'll get away with this, Sarah? No one's going to believe you. I'll bury you, will make you wish you'd never dared to cross me." His voice was a low growl, each syllable laced with the arrogance of a man who'd spent years bending the world to his will. But Sarah didn't flinch. Her grip on her gun tightened, her knuckles whitening as she held his gaze, her own eyes burning with a fire born of betrayal and righteous fury. "It's over, Miller," she said, her tone steady as stone. "I've got the unedited footage proof of every lie you've told, every life you've ruined. You're going to pay for it all." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of truth, a promise she'd fought tooth and nail to keep. Miller's face contorted, his teeth grinding audibly as rage consumed him. His wild eyes darted between Sarah and Jason, calculating, desperate. Then, in a flash of reckless defiance, he jerked his gun upward, his finger tightening on the trigger. But Jason was faster. A single, deafening shot rang out, the sound reverberating through the cramped office as the bullet tore into Miller's leg. He crumpled to the floor with a guttural cry, his weapon flying from his hand and skittering across the tiles, spinning to a stop near the overturned chair. Blood seeped through his pant leg, pooling beneath him as he clutched the wound. His face twisted in agony. Yet even then, sprawled and broken, he refused to yield. "You'll never win," he snarled through gritted teeth, his voice hoarse but defiant. "This system will always protect meats bigger than you, bigger than your pathetic little crusade." Sarah stepped forward, her boots clicking against the floor with deliberate precision, her gun still trained on him. She loomed over his crumpled form, her shadow stretching across him like a judgment. "The system you thought you could twist and manipulate is crumbling, Miller," she said, her voice low and unyielding. "We're tearing it down, piece by piece, and the truth is coming out. No one, not even you, can stop that." Her words weren't just a threat, they were a vow, forged in the fires of every sleepless night she'd spent piecing together evidence, every moment she doubted herself only to push forward anyway. Beside her, Jason moved with quiet efficiency, pulling a pair of handcuffs from his belt. The metallic clink as they snapped around Miller's wrists was a sound of finality, a chain binding him to the consequences he'd long evaded. "You've lost, Miller," Jason said, his voice calm but edged with steel. "Now you'll face real justice, and not the kind you've been doling out from behind your desk." Minutes later, the wail of sirens pierced the night, growing louder as police cars screeched to a halt outside. Officers poured into the building, their footsteps pounding up the stairs, their voices a chaotic hum as they assessed the scene. Sarah and Jason stood side by side, watching as Miller was hauled to his feet, his injured leg dragging uselessly, his face a mixture of pain and impotent rage. They handed him over to the arresting officers, and Jason slipped the USB drive of their hard-won evidence into his pocket. Its presence a quiet reassurance of their triumph. They'd done it. They'd uncovered the proof that would strip away Miller's lies and lay bare his corruption for the world to see. As the officers led him away, Sarah felt a weight lift from her shoulders, though her heart still raced with the adrenaline of the fight. This wasn't just about her honor anymore, it was about every person Miller had crushed under his boot, every life he'd tainted with his abuse of power. Days later, the precinct buzzed with a strange mix of relief and unease. The footage from the USB drive had been dissected frame by frame, its authenticity confirmed beyond doubt. It showed Miller's handiwork, events he'd doctored, witnesses he'd intimidated, a trail of deceit stretching back years. The news hit like a thunderclap, charges piling up against him, abuse of power, evidence tampering, coercion. A deeper probe uncovered a web of colleagues who'd turned a blind eye or worse, enabling his tyranny in exchange for favors or fear. For Sarah, watching it all unfold was like waking from a nightmare she'd been trapped in for months. She sat in her office, the walls adorned with plaques and medals that once felt hollow, her fingers tracing the edge of a framed photo of her younger self in uniform, wide-eyed, hopeful, unbroken. The battle had been brutal, a relentless slog through doubt and danger, but she'd emerged with her honor intact, her name cleared. More than that, she'd struck a blow against a system that had let men like Miller thrive for too long. Justice, she realized, wasn't just a word, it was a fire, one she'd kept burning through every dark hour. Jason stepped into the room, his lanky frame leaning against the doorframe, a warm smile tugging at his lips. "I still can't believe we pulled it off," he said, dropping into the chair across from her desk. His voice carried the weight of their shared struggle, but his eyes sparkled with pride. "We went all in, and now it's all out there, every dirty secret Miller tried to bury." Sarah returned his smile, though her expression held a quiet intensity, a resolve that hadn't faded with the victory. "It's not over, Jason," she said, leaning forward, her hands clasped on the desk. This was just one fight. It wasn't only about might, it was about everyone he hurt, everyone the system failed. "We've got to keep pushing, keep holding the line so no one else can abuse their power and shatter lives like he did." Jason nodded, his agreement unspoken but absolute. "You've got me with you, Sarah. You showed us all that justice can win, even when the odds are stacked against it." At that moment, Captain Davis entered, her presence commanding the room without effort. Her graying hair was pulled back tightly, her uniform crisp, but her eyes softened with a rare warmth as they settled on Sarah. "Thompson," she said, her voice firm yet laced with emotion, "what you've done here reeks extraordinary. I've seen a lot in my years, but the way you stood up to this, the way you fought for the truth, I'm damn proud to have you on this force." Sarah rose, extending her hand, and the handshake they shared was more than formal, it was a bond, a mutual recognition of the stakes they'd faced. "Thank you, Captain," Sarah replied, her voice steady. "I just did what I knew was right. After all this, I think we can start rebuilding trust in this city, in this system. It's not perfect, but it's worth saving." Davis gave a curt nod, her lips twitching into a faint smile. "You've proven that justice can hold, no matter how ugly it gets. That's more than most can say." As Davis left, Sarah drifted to the window, her gaze sweeping over the city she'd sworn to protect. Dawn was breaking, the first rays of sunlight spilling across the rooftops, painting the streets in hues of gold and amber. She felt a quiet renewal stirring within her, a sense that after the chaos and betrayal, something new could grow. Outside, a few of her colleagues passed by, their nods subtle but laden with respect, a respect she'd earned through blood and grit. Not just titles. Her honor was restored, yes, but more than that. Her faith in herself had solidified into something unbreakable. Back at her desk, she sat with a renewed purpose, the weight of responsibility settling over her like armor. The fight for justice wasn't finished, it never would debut. She was ready for whatever lay ahead. Sarah Thompson wasn't just a lieutenant anymore. She'd become a beacon, a living testament to resilience and the unyielding pursuit of truth. The scars of this chapter would stay with her, but they only fueled her determination. As the city woke to a new day, she knew her journey was far from over. There would be more battles, more shadows to chase, but she stood taller now, a warrior forged in the crucible of hardship, ready to defend the values she held dear. For Sarah, justice wasn't a destination, it was a promise, one she'd keep fighting for, no matter the cost.